Go live in the streets because you are nothing but a useless failure. My father Harrison screamed the words so loudly they echoed off the pristine brick houses of our quiet Atlanta suburb. He did not just say the words. He weaponized them using every ounce of breath in his lungs to make sure the entire neighborhood heard his absolute disdain for his own daughter. A second later, my heavy canvas duffel bag came flying through the open mahogany front door. It hit the ground with a dull, heavy thud, kicking up a cloud of dry summer dust right next to the gleaming tires of a brand-new white BMW. That car belonged to my younger sister Chloe and her white husband Preston. My mother Valerie stood just behind my father, leaning heavily on her aluminum walker with her arms crossed in absolute disgust. 35 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life, she scoffed, her face twisting into a sneer of deep disappointment. I stood at the bottom of the porch stairs, looking up at the house I had spent the last 2 solid months meticulously cleaning, cooking in, and maintaining. I had put my entire life on hold to nurse my mother through a grueling double knee replacement. Then I looked at Preston, who was leaning casually against one of the white porch columns, smirking down at me with his arms folded over his expensive cashmere sweater. He had decided he needed my temporary bedroom to use as his new startup office, and my parents were more than happy to throw their own daughter out into the cold street like yesterday's garbage just to accommodate him. I did not cry. I did not beg for them to let me stay. I just smiled, picked up my dusty bag, and walked away. What my arrogant family did not know was that the little computer hobby they constantly mocked and belittled was actually an artificial intelligence logistics firm that netted me $27 million a year. And exactly 2 weeks from this moment, Preston's supposedly elite but rapidly failing tech startup would come crawling and begging for a corporate buyout from a massive multinational holding company, my holding company. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect arrogant lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that karma always collects its debts in the end. To understand how we reached this explosive and deeply humiliating moment on the front lawn, you have to understand what the last 8 weeks of my life had looked like. When my mother Valerie scheduled her complex double knee replacement surgery, the entire family panicked. The doctors had been very clear that she would need round-the-clock care assistance with bathing, strict medication schedules, and constant physical therapy monitoring. Naturally, all eyes turned to my younger sister Chloe, the undisputed golden child of the family. Chloe immediately burst into theatrical tears, claiming her high-profile career as a luxury real estate agent was simply too demanding to take on such a burden. Preston chimed in, wrapping a protective arm around his wife, insisting that their busy elite lives could not accommodate the intense stress of full-time caregiving. Without a second thought, they flatly refused to help the woman who had given them everything. So I quietly stepped in. I packed up my comfortable independent life and moved back into my childhood bedroom to become their unpaid live-in nurse. For 60 grueling days, I woke up at 5 in the morning to prepare my parents' specific low-sodium breakfasts. I managed my mother's pain medications, tracked her physical therapy appointments, and scrubbed every single inch of their massive 4-bedroom house until my hands were raw and blistered. I did all of this while secretly running my multi-million-dollar empire, remotely working late into the quiet hours of the night while the rest of the house slept. I foolishly thought my immense sacrifice would finally earn me a shred of their respect. Instead, it only cemented my status as the family servant. They treated my continuous presence not as a generous gift, but as a basic expectation. The day of my eviction started like any other exhausting Thursday. I was in the kitchen preparing a specialized lunch for my mother when Preston and Chloe arrived unannounced. They breezed through the front door carrying expensive coffees and acting as though they owned the place. Preston immediately began complaining about how cramped his current office space was, and how the street noise in their luxury condo was disrupting his incredibly important investor meetings. I watched silently as my father Harrison practically tripped over himself to offer Preston a solution. Harrison had always worshipped Preston, viewing him as the absolute epitome of corporate success and the brilliant son he never had. Before I even realized what was happening, Harrison offered Preston my room. The very room I was currently living in, while providing free round-the-clock health care for his wife. I stepped out of the kitchen wiping my damp hands on a dish towel and asked calmly where I was supposed to sleep if Preston took my room. The air in the house shifted instantly, turning incredibly cold and intensely hostile. My father looked at me as if I were a cockroach that had just scurried across his pristine hardwood floor. "You can sleep on the living room couch, or you can finally get your own place," he snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "You have overstayed your welcome, Maya. It is time you stopped leeching off us and learned some actual independence." I stared at him, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of his words. Leeching off them. I was buying all their weekly groceries, paying for my mother's expensive prescription copays out of my own pocket, and saving them thousands of dollars in professional home healthcare costs. I calmly pointed out that I was only here to take care of Mom because Chloe and Preston had refused to lift a single finger to help. That was my fatal mistake. The exact moment I dared to speak the unvarnished truth, the moment I dared to criticize the precious golden child and her perfect husband, my father erupted into a blinding rage. He closed the distance between us, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Do not you dare speak about your sister that way," he bellowed, spit flying from his trembling lips. "Chloe is building a beautiful future. Preston is a true innovator, a real provider. You are just jealous because at 35 years old you are a massive failure who plays on a laptop all day. Pack your bags right now and get out of my house." I stood perfectly still, letting his unwarranted rage wash over me without flinching. My mother Valerie had hobbled out of the living room, leaning heavily on her metal walker. I looked to her, expecting at least a fraction of gratitude for the countless sleepless nights I had spent icing her swollen joints and helping her navigate the stairs. Instead, she just glared at me with an expression of pure disdain. "Your father is completely right, Maya," she said coldly, adjusting her silk robe. "You bring nothing but negative energy into this house. We need space for people who are actually moving forward in life. Preston needs a quiet environment for his startup, and you are just taking up valuable real estate." The profound, sickening irony of her words almost made me laugh out loud. Taking up valuable real estate. They had absolutely no idea who they were talking to or what I possessed. They only saw what I carefully allowed them to see: a quiet, observant woman who drove a highly reliable 5-year-old sedan and wore unbranded, simple clothing. They fundamentally mistook my modesty for poverty. They mistook my profound silence for weakness. I did not waste another breath trying to defend my worth to people committed to misunderstanding me. I walked upstairs, calmly packed my few basic belongings into my canvas duffel bag, and walked back down the staircase. Which brings us back to the sweltering front porch, where my father violently yanked the bag from my shoulder and threw it into the dirt like it was diseased. As I bent down to retrieve my bag, brushing the gray dust off the thick fabric, I looked up at Preston one last time. He gave me a patronizing little wave, a sickeningly smug smirk playing on his lips as he claimed his petty victory. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully established his dominance and secured his place as the undisputed family king. I hoisted the heavy strap onto my shoulder, feeling the physical weight of the bag, while simultaneously feeling a massive, suffocating weight lift completely off my chest. I looked at my father, whose chest was still heaving from his screaming fit. I looked at my mother, who was already turning her back on me to fuss over Preston and ask if he needed anything to drink. For my entire life, I had desperately craved their validation. I had twisted my personality into tight, uncomfortable knots, trying to be the daughter they could finally be proud of. But standing there in the oppressive Georgia heat, I realized I was finally free. Their cruel rejection was not a punishment, it was a beautiful, permanent release. I smiled, a genuine, bright smile that clearly unsettled my father, causing him to step back slightly. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked toward my modest car. I did not slam the car door in anger. I did not peel out of the driveway or leave angry skid marks on their precious asphalt. I simply put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, watching their perfect, toxic house shrink away into nothingness in my rearview mirror. The game was finally over, and the exhausting time for playing the obedient failure was permanently done. It was time to step into the light and show them exactly what 35 years of being underestimated can build. As the manicured lawns of my parents' subdivision faded into the distance in my rearview mirror, I let the heavy silence of my car wash over me. For the first time in 2 solid months, I was not rushing to answer a ringing bell or fetching a glass of iced water with exactly 3 cubes. I was just driving. And as the tires hummed against the warm Georgia asphalt, I allowed myself to truly examine how I had ended up playing the role of the miserable unwanted maid in my own family home. It all traced back to a fundamental dynamic that had governed our household for decades, a dynamic centered entirely around my younger sister Chloe. At 32 years old, Chloe was the undisputed sun around which my parents' entire universe revolved. She was a luxury real estate agent, though the word luxury was doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting in her job title. In reality, she sold perhaps 2 or 3 houses a year, but if you looked at her meticulously curated social media feeds, you would think she owned half of the upscale properties in Atlanta. She spent her days attending endless networking brunches, posing for photographs in empty mansions, and obsessing over maintaining an image of flawless affluence. She was loud, demanding, and completely consumed by status. Then she married Preston. Preston was a smooth-talking white man from a supposedly wealthy family up north who presented himself as an elite tech entrepreneur. He wore perfectly tailored suits without ties, used words like bandwidth and paradigm shift in casual conversation, and possessed an unearned, arrogant confidence that completely mesmerized my father. Harrison and Valerie viewed Preston as the ultimate prize. He was the golden ticket that validated their desperate need to be seen as upper crust and sophisticated. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, treating his every word like a gospel of modern business. They hung onto his vague startup pitches, as if he were the next great visionary of our generation. The disparity between how my parents treated Chloe and me was not just noticeable, it was entirely suffocating. The contrast was woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. If Chloe so much as sneezed, my parents were ready to clear their schedules and rush to her side. If she wanted to try a new expensive hobby, my father happily opened his wallet without a second thought. They catered to her every single whim, treating her like fragile royalty whose mere presence was a gift to be cherished. I, on the other hand, was treated like a household appliance, useful when needed but otherwise expected to remain silent and completely out of the way. I was the reliable workhorse. Chloe was the show pony. When I achieved something, it was met with a dismissive nod or a quick pivot back to whatever Chloe was doing. My parents viewed my quiet, observant nature not as a strength but as a glaring personality flaw. They equated loudness with success, and since I did not boast or brag, I was deemed a failure by default. This deeply toxic dynamic reached its absolute peak exactly 2 months ago. My mother Valerie had been complaining about severe joint pain for years, but when her doctor finally mandated a double knee replacement, the entire household went into an absolute state of panic. The surgeon was explicitly clear about the recovery process. Valerie would require extensive round-the-clock care. She would need constant physical assistance with standing, walking, and bathing. She would require someone to manage a highly complex schedule of physical therapy and heavy pain medications. My father, who loathed any disruption to his golf schedule and social life, immediately panicked. He called Chloe, fully expecting his perfect, capable daughter to swoop in and handle the family crisis. I remember listening to that phone call on speakerphone while standing in my parents' kitchen. Chloe did not even hesitate before flatly refusing the request. She sighed loudly, her voice dripping with fake, performative sympathy. She told our father that Preston and she were just entering a crucial quarter for his tech startup. She claimed they were negotiating with massive venture capitalists and that she had 3 high-profile showings in Buckhead that she could not possibly reschedule. "We simply cannot put our busy, high-profile lives on hold right now," she had whined into the receiver. "Preston is under so much pressure to scale his business and I have to support him." She offered to send a premium fruit basket instead, and then quickly changed the subject to her upcoming vacation plans. My parents did not display a single ounce of anger toward Chloe. They did not guilt her or demand that she step up. Instead, they nodded along, completely validating her selfish excuses. They told her they understood perfectly that Preston's brilliant business endeavors had to come first. The moment my father hung up the phone, he turned his attention directly to me. There was no polite request. There was no soft inquiry about my schedule or my life. There was only a cold, demanding expectation. "You are not doing anything important anyway," Harrison had stated, glaring at me as if my mere presence was an annoyance. "You can move back into your old room and take care of your mother." And because I was still secretly foolishly craving that elusive parental approval, I packed my bags. I left my serene, perfectly organized, independent life and returned to the house that had always felt like a suffocating cage. I stepped in to manage the household completely free of charge. From the moment I unpacked my duffel bag, my life ceased to be my own. I became the unpaid, invisible family servant. I cooked 3 specialized low-sodium meals a day. I managed detailed spreadsheets of Valerie's medications, setting alarms at all hours of the night to ensure she never missed a single dose. I scrubbed the bathrooms, did the laundry, and held her hand while she cried through her agonizing physical therapy exercises. Meanwhile, Chloe and Preston would drop by once a week for a maximum of 20 minutes. They would breeze through the front door, bringing a single store-bought pastry, complimenting themselves loudly on making the time to visit despite their elite schedules. Chloe would snap a quick, perfectly angled selfie, kissing my mother's cheek, post it online with a caption about family being everything, and then they would vanish back to their supposedly glamorous lives. During these brief visits, Preston would treat me like the hired help, casually asking me to fetch him a glass of sparkling water, or complaining that the house smelled too much like antiseptic. My parents would spend the rest of the week glowing about how wonderful it was that Chloe and Preston managed to squeeze them in. They never once thanked me for actually doing the grueling physical labor of keeping my mother comfortable and safe. What made the entire situation almost comical was the massive secret I was keeping while they slept. They thought I was a jobless failure sitting in my childhood bedroom playing on the internet. In reality, I was running a massive corporate empire. While my mother napped after her afternoon therapy, I was negotiating international shipping contracts. While I was stirring a pot of soup for my father, I was reviewing quarterly projections that showed my company crossing the $27 million mark in pure profit. I had built a highly successful artificial intelligence logistics firm that handled complex fulfillment systems for global e-commerce brands. I had a team of brilliant executives reporting to me. But under my parents' roof, I was just Maya, the useless daughter who needed to make sure the pillows were fluffed perfectly. I intentionally kept my wealth completely hidden. I drove a highly reliable 5-year-old sedan because it was practical and safe, not because I could not afford a fleet of luxury cars. I wore high-quality, simple basics that lacked flashy designer logos. I did not need to broadcast my net worth to the world to feel valuable. But my family interpreted my modesty as undeniable proof of my poverty. Because I did not wear expensive belts or drive a leased luxury vehicle like Chloe, they assumed I was dead broke. Because I did not speak in empty corporate buzzwords like Preston, they assumed I was entirely uneducated in the ways of the business world. They took my silence for stupidity. They took my service for desperation. They honestly believed I was staying with them and acting as a nurse because I had absolutely nowhere else to go. Every time I quietly absorbed one of their cutting remarks, every time I washed a dish or fluffed a pillow while listening to them praise the daughter who had abandoned them in their time of need, I was making a calculation. I was recognizing the absolute, undeniable truth of my place in their hearts. They did not love me. They only loved what I could do for them when their golden child refused to carry the burden. And even then my service was met with total contempt rather than gratitude, setting the stage for a reckoning they could never possibly see coming. To comprehend how my parents could look at their own flesh and blood and see nothing but a maid, you have to understand the environment that shaped us. Growing up in a middle-class African-American household in an Atlanta suburb, my parents worshipped at the altar of social status. Harrison and Valerie were obsessed with optics. Every word we spoke in public was meticulously calculated to project an image of excellence to our neighbors and church congregation. In their rigid minds, success was a narrow traditional hallway. You were either a doctor, a lawyer, or a highly respected corporate executive climbing a recognized ladder. There was absolutely no room for deviation. From the moment Chloe and I were old enough to comprehend expectations, the heavy weight of their demands settled onto our shoulders. Chloe gravitated toward the superficial elements of this lifestyle. She quickly learned that as long as she wore the right dresses, smiled at luncheons, and associated with the right families, our parents would overlook almost any failing. I was cursed with an analytical mind that cared nothing for neighborhood gossip or the brand of the car in our driveway. I cared about efficiency structure and solving complex logical puzzles. I was a quiet child who preferred disassembling old radios over attending weekend debutante balls. My parents viewed my introverted curiosity not as a budding intellect, but as a massive social liability. They desperately wanted two perfect showpiece daughters they could parade around at cocktail hours. Instead, they got Chloe the social butterfly and me the quiet girl, who was always buried in a textbook or sketching supply chain diagrams on church bulletins. They pressured me to conform to their ideals, pushing me aggressively toward the legal profession. A lawyer daughter was a trophy. It was a tangible marker of their exceptional parenting. For a long time, I tried to play the part. I enrolled in pre-law classes. I bought the expensive suits. I sat in my university lecture halls taking meticulous notes on constitutional law, while feeling my soul wither away with each passing semester. Every family dinner felt like a deposition. Harrison would interrogate me about my LSAT preparation, demanding to know my practice scores and comparing me to the children of his golf buddies. Valerie would critique my posture and my refusal to network with partners at prestigious local firms. They were suffocating me, trying to force a square peg into a very specific, socially acceptable round hole. And the harder they pushed, the more I realized I was actively participating in my own destruction, just to secure a fraction of their conditional love. The ultimate breaking point occurred during my junior year of college. I had spent months slipping away to the computer labs teaching myself programming languages like Python. I was mesmerized by artificial intelligence and global supply chain logistics. I saw massive glaring inefficiencies in how e-commerce businesses routed their inventory, and I knew with absolute certainty that I could build a system to fix it. My mind operated in algorithms, not in courtroom theatrics. So one Sunday evening during a formal family dinner, I placed my fork down and calmly announced that I was dropping my pre-law track. I told them I would not be applying to any law schools. Instead, I was going to focus entirely on software engineering and business logistics. The explosion that followed my announcement was absolutely legendary. Harrison slammed his fist onto the dining room table so hard the glasses rattled. He turned a dangerous shade of crimson, screaming that I was throwing away my future for a pipe dream. Valerie burst into tears, wailing about how she would explain this embarrassment to her friends. They did not try to understand my vision. They did not ask a single question about the software I was building or the market gap I had identified. They only saw that their carefully constructed narrative of having a high-powered attorney daughter had been completely destroyed in an instant. From that evening onward, my permanent role in the family was officially established. I was no longer just the quiet daughter, I was the family failure. When I graduated with a degree in computer science, they refused to even attend the ceremony. They told me that writing code was a job for antisocial losers and that I had ruined my chances at a respectable life. Meanwhile, Chloe, who had barely scraped through a communications degree, was being celebrated with a massive graduation party, simply because she had secured a low-level position at a real estate brokerage owned by one of my father's wealthy friends. The contrast was staggering. My parents began actively hiding my existence from their social circles. If someone asked about me, they would vaguely mention that I was struggling to find my path, or doing administrative computer work. They painted me as a tragic disappointment they had to endure. This relentless emotional branding could have broken me. It could have forced me to abandon my complex logistics software and crawl back to their predefined path just to stop the endless stream of criticism. When you are told every single day by the people who brought you into this world that you are a useless failure, the easiest thing to do is to eventually believe them. I could have surrendered and accepted the miserable life they had mapped out for me. But I did not break. And the reason I was able to withstand their suffocating toxicity and quietly build a $27 million empire under their noses was all thanks to one person. My grandfather Thomas was the only member of my family who truly saw me. Thomas was my father's father, but the two men could not have been more fundamentally different. While Harrison cared only about country clubs and corporate titles, Thomas was a deeply pragmatic man who had spent 40 years running his own highly successful commercial freight business. He did not care about designer suits. He cared about hard work, structural integrity, and how things were built. When I was a little girl, while my parents were busy forcing Chloe into expensive pageant dresses, Thomas would take me out to his dusty garage. He would let me sit on a wooden stool and watch him organize his complex freight manifests, showing me exactly how he routed dozens of trucks across the country to maximize fuel efficiency. Thomas recognized my analytical brain instantly. When I started asking him detailed questions about optimization algorithms, when I was only 12 years old, he did not tell me to go play with dolls. He pulled out a large map and explained his entire logistical system to me. He was the one who bought me my first computer. He was the one who encouraged me to look under the hood of every system I encountered. When I made the terrifying decision to drop pre-law and face the wrath of my status-obsessed parents, Thomas was the only one who called me to say he was proud. He told me that Harrison was a fool who only understood how to follow the crowd, while I had the rare gift of seeing where the crowd was going before they even started moving. Never let them make you feel small, Maya. He would tell me, his deep, raspy voice providing the ultimate armor against my parents' constant belittling. They only respect what they can brag about at a dinner party. You are building something that is going to change the actual world. Let them talk. Let them think you are failing. Keep your head down, do the work, and let the results speak for themselves. Thomas passed away during my senior year of college, just as I was laying the foundational code for Auratech. Losing him was the most profound heartbreak of my life. I stood at his funeral, listening to my father deliver a superficial eulogy that focused entirely on my grandfather's financial success rather than his generous spirit. I promised Thomas silently right then that I would honor his unwavering belief in me. I would build my logistics empire. And most importantly, I would follow his advice to the letter. I would let my parents and my sister think whatever they wanted about my quiet, unbranded life. I would absorb their insults, their condescension, and their absolute lack of faith without saying a single word in my defense. His voice stayed with me every day. It was the emotional bedrock that allowed me to sit in my childhood bedroom years later, listening to my father call me a useless failure without shedding a single tear. Because of Thomas, I knew exactly what my true worth was. I did not need Harrison or Valerie to validate my existence. I had built a towering fortress of success, and every time my family tried to tear me down, they were simply throwing stones at reinforced titanium. They thought they were punishing a broken woman. They had absolutely no idea they were actively antagonizing a corporate titan who was holding their entire financial future in the palm of her hand. The truth of my existence was something my family lacked the cognitive capacity to even begin to comprehend. While they mocked me as a jobless dependent, clicking away aimlessly on a laptop, I was actually sitting at the absolute pinnacle of a corporate behemoth. 5 years ago, in the cramped confines of a cheap studio apartment, I had taken the foundational code I built during my college days and launched Auratech. It started as a humble predictive algorithm designed to help independent boutique owners minimize shipping costs. But the software was brilliant. It possessed a machine learning capability that adapted to supply chain disruptions faster than any human logistics manager ever could. Within 2 years, we scaled massively. We transitioned from small boutiques to handling the entire complex fulfillment systems for global e-commerce giants. My software managed cargo ships crossing the Pacific warehouse distribution centers in the Midwest and last-mile delivery fleets in every major metropolitan city in the country. We optimized routes, predicted consumer demand spikes, and eliminated millions of dollars in operational waste for our clients. Auratech was not just a successful company, it was an absolute industry disruptor. And as the sole founder and chief executive officer, I retained complete ownership. I did not answer to venture capitalists or demanding boards of directors. I answered only to myself. The profit margins were staggering. Last year alone, my personal net income after corporate taxes and employee payroll netted exactly $27 million. I had more wealth sitting in my diversified investment portfolios than my father and Preston could ever hope to accumulate in 10 lifetimes of their desperate corporate climbing. I possessed the kind of liquid capital that could buy my parents' entire subdivision in cash. Yet if you looked at me, you would never suspect I held that kind of immense financial power. That was entirely by design. I practiced the art of stealth wealth with religious devotion. My grandfather Thomas had warned me about the corrupting influence of flashy money, and I took his lessons to heart. My sister Chloe defined her entire self-worth by the massive interlocking logos plastered across her designer handbags. She leased a white BMW that stretched her monthly budget to the absolute breaking point just so she could toss the keys onto the table at brunch and ensure everyone knew what she drove. Preston was exactly the same, drowning in high-interest credit card debt just to maintain a closet full of Italian suits and a country club membership he rarely used. They were incredibly loud about their fabricated wealth. I was completely silent about my actual fortune. I drove a 5-year-old silver sedan. It was impeccably maintained, highly reliable, and blended perfectly into any parking lot in the city. To my status-obsessed parents, driving an older, non-luxury vehicle was the ultimate admission of utter failure. My mother, Valerie, frequently suggested I park around the corner when her friends came over so the neighbors would not see my embarrassing car sitting in her pristine driveway. My wardrobe was another source of their constant condescension. I did not wear loud belts or carry easily recognizable bags. Instead, I wore custom-tailored cashmere sweaters, hand-stitched silk blouses, and bespoke leather loafers imported directly from private artisans in Italy. My clothing was exceptionally expensive, crafted from the finest materials available on the market, but it completely lacked recognizable branding. Because I did not function as a walking billboard for European fashion houses, my mother assumed I was buying my clothes off the clearance racks at discount department stores. She frequently offered me her gaudy hand-me-downs, telling me with a pitying sigh that I needed to dress better if I ever wanted to secure a husband who could provide for me. I always accepted her discarded polyester blouses with a polite smile, depositing them directly into a donation bin the moment I left the house. I found profound amusement in their tragic lack of sophistication. They were so utterly blinded by their pursuit of cheap external validation that they could not recognize actual wealth standing right in front of them. This deliberate disguise made the surreal juxtaposition of my daily life under their roof feel like a bizarre social experiment. I was living a double life that strained the very limits of human endurance. My childhood bedroom had become the secret global headquarters of Auratech. The walls were still painted the exact same pale lilac color my mother had chosen for me when I was a teenager. The old wooden desk where I used to struggle through high school calculus was now supporting a secure encrypted dual monitor setup that processed millions of dollars in international trade daily. I would sit on my old floral bedspread, wearing a simple cotton t-shirt, muting my microphone on a high-stakes corporate Zoom call just to listen for the sharp ringing of a small silver bell. That bell was my mother's favorite weapon. She kept it on her bedside table, ringing it aggressively whenever she required immediate service. The dissonance was absolutely jarring. At 10 in the morning, I would be firmly negotiating a massive multi-year contract with a major European shipping conglomerate, coolly rejecting their counteroffers and protecting my company's aggressive profit margins. Then the silver bell would chime violently from the master bedroom down the hall. I would type a quick message to my executive assistant Keisha, instructing her to finalize the legal paperwork, and sprint down the hallway. I would transition instantly from a ruthless tech titan to a subservient maid. I would enter the master suite where Valerie lay propped up on a mountain of decorative pillows, watching daytime television. She would not even look away from the screen as she demanded fresh ice packs for her swollen knees, complaining loudly that the water I brought her 10 minutes ago was no longer the precise temperature she desired. I would nod respectfully, take the warm glass, and hurry down the stairs to the kitchen. The physical and mental toll of this charade was immense. The kitchen became my second office. I spent hours standing over the stove, meticulously preparing the strict, low-sodium meals the surgeon had mandated for her recovery. I chopped fresh vegetables, simmered homemade broths, and grilled lean proteins, all while keeping my wireless earpiece hidden beneath my hair. While my hands were covered in flour or chicken broth, my mind was navigating complex supply chain bottlenecks in the Pacific Northwest. I would quietly dictate instructions to my senior logistics managers, detailing exactly how to reroute cargo trucks around a massive snowstorm in Denver, while simultaneously checking the oven timer for my mother's baked salmon. The stress of maintaining this flawless facade required absolute discipline. I could never let my corporate stress bleed into my domestic servitude. If I appeared exhausted, Harrison would accuse me of being lazy. If I checked my phone too frequently, Valerie would snap that my useless internet browsing was distracting me from my duties as her nurse. There were afternoons when I had just secured a highly lucrative contract that would increase my net worth by another $2 million, and I could not even celebrate. I had to swallow the massive surge of professional adrenaline and immediately kneel on the hardwood floor to carefully wrap my mother's bruised legs in compression bandages while she critiqued my technique. She would tell me my hands were too rough, complaining that Chloe would have been much gentler, despite the undeniable fact that Chloe had not visited the house in over 12 days. I absorbed the insults while calculating employee holiday bonuses in my head. I let them treat me like absolute dirt, because every single insult simply reinforced my hidden power. They thought they had trapped a failure in their home. They had no idea they were housing a lion who was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The sheer absurdity of the situation often felt like a surreal cinematic performance where I was the only person aware of the cameras. I would carry a polished wooden tray laden with carefully portioned healthy snacks up the grand sweeping staircase of their home. Every step I took was a physical reminder of the vast chasm between my reality and their delusion. As I reached the landing, Harrison would routinely block my path, demanding to know if I had remembered to pick up his dry cleaning. The man standing before me demanding subservience was earning a fraction of what my company accumulated in a single fiscal quarter. Yet he spoke to me with the authority of an emperor addressing a peasant. I would look at his perfectly pressed suit, the one he wore to his mid-level management job at a regional bank, and I would feel a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me. I would smile politely, assure him that his shirts were hanging perfectly in his closet, and proceed to my mother's room to deliver her meal. My ability to compartmentalize this abuse stemmed directly from the silent armor I had forged over the past decade. I did not need them to see my crown to know that I was a queen. My wealth was not just a number in an offshore bank account, it was the ultimate manifestation of my independence and my absolute rejection of their superficial value system. Every dollar Oratech generated was a testament to the fact that I was right, and they were fundamentally wrong. While they lived in a precarious house of cards built on debt-leased luxury goods and the desperate need for neighborhood approval, I stood on an impenetrable foundation of liquid capital and global influence. Fetching ice packs, cooking salmon, and absorbing their endless verbal abuse was merely a temporary assignment. I was observing them, studying their weaknesses, mapping the exact dimensions of their arrogance. I was gathering the raw data I would eventually use to completely dismantle their false reality. They believed I was trapped in that house performing menial labor because I lacked the intelligence to do anything else. They never suspected that I was simply a highly successful undercover operative patiently collecting the debts they owed me before I finally burned their toxic empire to the ground. The tension in the house was a living, breathing entity that seemed to thicken with every passing day. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the oppressive Georgia heat was pressing hard against the thin glass of my childhood bedroom window. I was sitting at my battered wooden desk wearing a simple beige blouse that cost more than my father's entire golf wardrobe. On my screen was a highly secure encrypted video conference with my top executives and the board of directors from a massive European shipping conglomerate. We were in the absolute final stages of closing a landmark expansion deal for Oratech. This specific contract would increase our overseas fulfillment capacity by 40% and add another $8 million to our annual revenue stream. My chief operating officer was projecting the quarterly forecasts on the screen, and I was just about to unmute my microphone to deliver the final non-negotiable terms of our aggressive acquisition strategy. The stakes were incredibly high. My entire executive team was waiting in hushed silence for my final authorization to proceed with the legal signatures. Then, without a single knock, the door to my bedroom flew open. It slammed against the drywall with a loud, aggressive crack that echoed violently through my noise-canceling headset. My father Harrison stood in the doorway. He was wearing his usual country club attire, a pastel polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki slacks, his face twisted into a familiar scowl of deep irritation. He did not care that I was wearing a professional headset. He did not care that my dual monitors were filled with complex global data dashboards and the focused faces of serious international executives. In his narrow mind, I was merely playing a childish game in my bedroom. "Are you still typing away for pennies on the internet?" Harrison barked, his booming voice easily cutting through the room and undoubtedly bleeding into my sensitive microphone. "I have called your name 3 times from the bottom of the stairs, Maya. I am not going to stand down there and scream for you while you mess around with your little computer hobby." I froze completely. On my screen, I saw the confused, startled faces of the European executives. My chief operating officer, who knew exactly how much raw power I wielded within the industry, blinked in absolute shock at the sudden disrespectful intrusion. With lightning speed and practiced precision, I hit the mute button on my headset. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion, turning slowly to look at my father. I held up one single finger, a silent, polite request for just a moment of grace so I could excuse myself professionally from a multi-million-dollar negotiation. Harrison completely ignored the gesture. He marched into the room, his golf cleats clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He carried a bundle of fabric draped over his arm. "Stop clicking those buttons and listen to me when I am speaking to you," he demanded, tossing the bundle directly onto my floral bedspread. I quickly typed a message into the secure executive chat stating that an urgent facility issue required my immediate attention. I instructed my operating officer to proceed with the preliminary contract signatures in my brief absence and assured them I would review the final documents within the hour. I closed the laptop screen with a soft, decisive click. The massive European expansion would simply have to wait. My father required my immediate attention for what was undoubtedly a trivial domestic matter. "What do you need?" I asked, my voice completely level, betraying absolutely none of the blinding rage that was currently pooling heavily in my chest. Harrison pointed a rigid, aggressive finger at the pile of fabric on my bed. "Chloe and Preston are coming for a formal family dinner tonight. Preston is coming straight from a massive investor pitch for his tech startup. He called and said his assistant forgot to pick up his dry cleaning. He needs these dress shirts ironed and starched perfectly before he arrives. Your mother is resting and I have to go pick up the wine." I looked at the pile resting on my bed. They were expensive, custom-tailored Italian silk blend dress shirts. Preston, a man who viewed me as nothing more than an unfortunate blemish on his perfect wife's family tree, had casually decided that his sister-in-law should act as his personal unpaid laundress. And my father, a man who should have protected his own daughter's dignity, was incredibly eager to enforce that exact toxic dynamic. "Preston wants me to iron his shirts," I repeated, stating the fact plainly, just to hear the sheer absurdity of it spoken aloud in the room. "Do not use that tone with me," Harrison snapped. stepping closer, his imposing figure attempting to physically intimidate me into submission. Preston is out there hustling. He is building a real future for your sister. He is a provider. He does not have time to worry about wrinkled collars when he is securing major venture capital. You are sitting here taking up valuable space in my house, living absolutely rent-free while your mother recovers. The absolute least you can do is contribute to this family by making yourself useful instead of staring at a screen all day. The words were specifically designed to cut deep. Living rent-free, making myself useful. He was treating my time as if it possessed absolutely zero value. In his mind, my entire existence was worthless unless it was actively serving the comfort of his golden child and her supposedly elite husband. He honestly believed that Preston's failing startup, a company I already knew through my industry contacts, was bleeding cash, and struggling to meet basic payroll was infinitely more important than the multi-million-dollar logistics empire I was currently running from this very desk. I could have opened my laptop right then. I could have pulled up my corporate bank accounts. I could have shown him the pending contract I had just paused, a contract worth more than he had earned in his entire 40-year career at the regional bank. I could have completely destroyed his fragile, arrogant worldview with 3 simple clicks of my mouse, but I did not. Instead, I nodded calmly. "I will handle the shirts," I said, maintaining my perfectly blank expression. Harrison huffed, adjusting his collar with a look of smug satisfaction. "See that you do. Make sure you use heavy starch on the blue one. Preston likes the collar crisp, and when you are done with that, go check on your mother's ice packs. We are eating at 7 sharp. Do not be late, and please try to wear something presentable for once." He turned and walked out, leaving the bedroom door wide open behind him. I sat in the suffocating silence of my room, staring at the crumpled heap of Preston's expensive shirts. I reached over and opened my laptop. The deal had been successfully secured by my operating officer. The European expansion was officially locked in. I had just made more money in the last 10 minutes than Preston would see in a decade of his desperate corporate posturing. I closed the laptop again, stood up, and gathered the shirts into my arms. I walked down the hall to the laundry room, retrieved the old ironing board, and set it up. I plugged in the iron, waiting patiently for the red indicator light to signal it was hot. As I carefully laid out Preston's pale blue shirt, smoothing the expensive fabric with my bare hands, I felt an intense, profound sense of absolute clarity wash over me. I was not complying out of weakness. I was not ironing this shirt because I believed my father's cruel assessment of my worth. I was doing this as a deliberate, highly calculated act of emotional discipline. I was building a silent mental ledger. Every single insult Harrison hurled at me, every condescending demand Valerie made from her recovery bed, every arrogant smirk Preston flashed in my direction was meticulously recorded in my mind. They were actively writing checks against a bank account of goodwill that was rapidly approaching a permanent zero balance. As the hot steam hissed aggressively against the fabric, pressing out the deep wrinkles, I categorized the disrespect. Line item 1, interrupting a multi-million-dollar board meeting to mock my career. Line item 2, treating me as an unpaid domestic servant to cater to an arrogant man who married my sister. Line item 3, reminding me that my presence in my childhood home was viewed as a burdensome charity case rather than a generous sacrifice of my own time. This silent ledger was my emotional fuel. I knew with absolute certainty that the day was coming very soon when I would sever these toxic family ties permanently. When you decide to cut off your own parents, society tells you to feel guilty. They tell you that blood is thicker than water, that you must forgive, and forget that you must always turn the other cheek. But I was ensuring that when the moment of ultimate severance arrived, I would feel absolutely no guilt whatsoever. I was gathering the undeniable daily proof that they did not love me. They did not respect me. They viewed me simply as an object to be used and discarded at their convenience. I pressed the heavy iron hard against the collar using the exact heavy starch Harrison had demanded. I made the collar razor sharp. I made sure every single crease was eliminated from the sleeves. I executed the demeaning task with absolute flawless perfection. Let Preston wear this immaculate shirt to dinner tonight. Let him sit at the head of our family table and boast loudly about his imaginary wealth. Let my father look at him with shining, desperate pride. Let my mother praise Chloe for securing such a brilliant, wealthy provider. I would sit quietly at the other end of the table. I would eat the food I had secretly purchased with my own money. I would serve them the dessert I had carefully prepared. I would absorb their passive-aggressive comments and their subtle, cruel digs at my single status and my quiet lifestyle. Because the more they took from me now, the more devastating the final bill would be when I finally presented it to them. I hung the freshly pressed shirts on wooden hangers, admiring my own meticulous handiwork. The trap was being laid not by my hands, but by their own relentless, blinding arrogance. They were so consumed by their pursuit of status that they were actively pushing away the one person who actually had the power to save them from the massive financial ruin that was secretly heading their way. I carried the shirts back upstairs, my face a mask of total obedience, my mind operating like a lethal algorithm. The dinner party was waiting, and I was exactly where I needed to be, keeping my ledger perfectly updated and preparing the ground for my final glorious strike. The dining room table was set with my mother's finest china and crystal stemware. I had spent the last 4 hours in the sweltering kitchen executing a flawless culinary performance that rivaled a 5-star restaurant. The menu consisted of a perfectly roasted prime rib with a red wine reduction garlic butter asparagus and truffle mashed potatoes. My mother had specifically requested this extravagant menu days ago, but when the time came to purchase the ingredients, my father conveniently claimed he had forgotten his wallet at the bank. I did not argue. I simply drove to the premium grocer and paid the $400 grocery bill using one of my unbranded debit cards. I cooked the entire feast while my parents sat comfortably in the air-conditioned living room, waiting for their golden child to arrive. At exactly 6:30, the front door swung open. Chloe made her grand entrance wearing a pristine white designer sundress and carrying a notoriously expensive leather handbag that I knew for a fact cost more than 3 months of her mortgage payments. Preston trailed behind her wearing the pale blue silk shirt I had just meticulously pressed and starched. His collar was razor-sharp, framing his smug face perfectly. Neither of them offered a greeting or a simple thank you as they breezed past me in the foyer. Chloe immediately rushed to the sofa to fawn over our mother, loudly complimenting Valerie on how well she was healing, while completely ignoring the woman who had actually been managing that recovery. I served the dinner with the silent efficiency of a hired banquet waitstaff. I poured the expensive Cabernet Sauvignon my father had taken out of his wine fridge, another item I had quietly replaced weeks ago when his stock ran low. As I finally took my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, the main event began. This dinner was not a family gathering to check on a recovering mother. It was a captive audience for Preston to loudly broadcast his fabricated brilliance. Preston dominated the conversation before the first plates were even passed. He swirled his expensive wine and leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of a weary but triumphant tech visionary. He launched into a lengthy, boasting monologue about his startup Nova Flow. According to Preston, he was on the absolute brink of revolutionizing the entire global supply chain industry. He threw around empty corporate buzzwords with dizzying speed. He talked aggressively about leveraging cloud-native disruption, deploying synergistic blockchain algorithms, and utilizing agile paradigm shifts to dominate the market. My father, Harrison, leaned forward, hanging onto every single ridiculous syllable, as if Preston were handing down golden tablets from a mountaintop. Valerie smiled proudly at Chloe, silently congratulating her younger daughter for securing such an absolute genius. I sat quietly slicing my prime rib and listening to the most spectacular display of corporate delusion I had ever witnessed. Preston sounded incredibly impressive to people who had absolutely no idea how the tech industry actually functioned, but I knew exactly what NovaFlow was. My acquisition team at Auratech had compiled a preliminary dossier on his company 3 months ago, when they briefly popped up on our radar as a minor market annoyance. My internal monologue dissected his arrogant speech with brutal cold analytics. I knew for an absolute fact that NovaFlow was hemorrhaging capital at a catastrophic rate. Preston's cloud-native disruption was actually a notoriously unstable server architecture that was costing him hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in maintenance fees. His user acquisition costs were completely unsustainable, and his logistics backend was a tangled, disorganized nightmare. He had burned through his initial seed funding by renting a massive flashy office space in Midtown Atlanta and buying custom espresso machines for a staff of 20 people who produced virtually zero viable code. The man sitting at the head of my family table, drinking the wine I paid for, was drowning in a sea of massive toxic debt, but he was performing the role of the tech billionaire with absolute flawless conviction. It was a masterclass in aggressive arrogance. Preston casually complained about how exhausting it was to be the smartest person in every boardroom. He complained about his developers being too slow to grasp his massive vision. Chloe chimed in loudly, complaining about how hard it was to be the supportive wife of a man who was destined to change the world. She reached over and patted his hand, telling my parents that they were already looking at upgrading to a massive estate in Buckhead once NovaFlow went public next year. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, keeping my face entirely blank. NovaFlow was not going public. According to my own private industry data, NovaFlow was approximately 4 weeks away from completely missing payroll. As I cleared the main course plates and brought out the vanilla bean creme brulee, I had spent an hour torching the conversation suddenly and unfortunately shifted directly to me. Chloe took a delicate bite of her dessert and looked down the table at me with a sickeningly sweet expression. "The food is actually quite edible tonight, Maya," she said, delivering the backhanded compliment with a small shrug. "It is good that you have so much free time to practice your cooking while you are staying here." Preston chuckled, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and fixed me with a look of profound, patronizing pity. "You know, Maya, Chloe and I were talking on the drive over," he began, his voice dripping with faux benevolence. "We know you have been struggling for a very long time. Sitting in your childhood bedroom playing on the internet all day cannot be good for your mental health. A person needs actual purpose. They need to contribute to society." I stopped eating and looked at him. I did not speak. I simply waited for him to dig the hole deeper. "My startup is expanding at a massive rate," Preston continued, gesturing grandly with his hands. "And while we usually only hire top-tier Ivy League talent, I told Chloe that family comes first. I am willing to do you a massive favor. I have a position opening up for a data entry clerk. It is basic mindless work, simply inputting numbers into a spreadsheet, cleaning up server logs, that sort of thing. It pays $15 an hour. It is minimum wage, but it would get you out of the house. It would give you a reason to wake up in the morning, and frankly, it would get you on your feet so you can finally stop leeching off Harrison and Valerie." The sheer audacity of the offer hung heavy in the dining room air. $15 an hour. The man whose entire company generated less annual revenue than what my personal investment portfolio yielded in a single Tuesday afternoon was offering me a minimum wage data entry job out of the goodness of his heart. Harrison slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the dessert spoons. "That is an incredible opportunity, Maya," he barked, his eyes wide with aggressive excitement. "Preston is throwing you an absolute lifeline. You should be down on your knees thanking him for even considering bringing someone with your spotty track record into his elite company." Valerie nodded enthusiastically from her chair. "It is incredibly generous of you, Preston," she gushed, clasping her hands together. Maya has always lacked ambition. This is exactly the kind of strict corporate discipline she desperately needs. You are saving her life. I looked at Preston, who was sitting there with a smug, self-satisfied smile waiting for my overwhelming gratitude. I looked at Chloe, who was inspecting her manicured fingernails, clearly enjoying my public humiliation. I looked at my parents, who were practically glowing with pride for their incredible son-in-law. I took a deep breath, carefully placing my napkin on the table. "That is a very generous offer, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "However, I am going to have to decline. I have my own projects that require my full attention right now, but I truly appreciate you thinking of me." The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Harrison stood up from his chair, his face turning an alarming shade of red. Decline, he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. You are in no position to decline anything. You are a 35-year-old failure living in my house, eating my food, and taking up my space. Preston is offering you a real job, a chance to work for a brilliant innovator, and you have the absolute gall to reject it for your imaginary internet projects. Valerie joined in, gripping the edges of the table. You are so incredibly ungrateful, Maya. This is exactly why you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. You are arrogant and lazy. Preston goes out of his way to offer you charity and you spit right in his face. You will never amount to anything with this horrible, toxic attitude. Preston held up a hand, playing the calm mediator. Now, Harrison, Valerie, let us not get upset, he said, adopting a tone of deep, tragic disappointment. You cannot help someone who refuses to help themselves. I tried. Chloe and I both tried to lift her up. If Maya wants to spend the rest of her life hiding in a bedroom achieving absolutely nothing, we just have to accept that she lacks the basic intellect and drive to operate in the real business world. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the vicious verbal assault without blinking. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my intellect. I did not try to explain the massive global empire I was currently running from my laptop. I simply updated my silent mental ledger. I logged every scream, every insult, every condescending shake of Preston's head. They were entirely convinced they were putting a pathetic failure in her place. They were utterly certain of their own supreme superiority. I looked around the table at the red, angry faces of my parents and the smug, triumphant faces of my sister and her husband. I absorbed their absolute certainty that I was nothing, and I filed it away, meticulously locking it in the vault of my mind alongside every other piece of emotional ammunition I was stockpiling for the final devastating blow. The suffocating tension in the dining room hung heavy as I quietly collected the cleared dinner plates. I moved around the large mahogany table with practiced invisibility, carrying the remnants of the prime rib feast back to the kitchen. When I returned carrying a heavy silver tray laden with individual ramekins of vanilla bean creme brulee, the conversation had shifted slightly, but the arrogant tone remained exactly the same. I placed a delicate porcelain ramekin in front of Preston, who barely paused his aggressive monologue to acknowledge the service. He tapped his silver spoon against the caramelized sugar, cracking the pristine surface, while sighing heavily about the immense burdens of corporate leadership. He complained loudly that the weekend commute from their downtown luxury condo to my parents' suburban neighborhood was draining his highly valuable mental energy. Chloe immediately leaned in, rubbing his shoulder in a performative display of devoted wifely support. She whined that Preston simply could not disconnect from his massive executive responsibilities. He needed to be constantly available to his venture capitalists, and the current setup in my parents' living room was simply too chaotic for a tech visionary of his exceptional caliber. The television was always too loud, the ambient noise was far too distracting, and he absolutely required a dedicated soundproof environment to execute his brilliant global strategies. I stood near the edge of the dining table, keeping my hands folded neatly in front of me, listening to a grown man demand a dedicated office space in a house he did not own for weekend visits he barely made. Preston took a small bite of his dessert and looked directly at my father, Harrison. He stated that if NovaFlow was going to scale globally and reach its billion-dollar valuation, he needed a completely silent workspace right here at the house so he could comfortably spend more weekends visiting his beloved in-laws. He suggested with staggering entitlement that they convert one of the upstairs bedrooms into a private executive suite specifically tailored for his needs. He wanted the walls painted a dark slate gray to boost his productivity and demanded they install dedicated high-speed fiber optic internet lines so his video conferences would never buffer. He detailed exactly how the room should be oriented to maximize natural light for his brainstorming sessions, and insisted that all of my personal belongings be completely removed by the end of the week so the contractor could begin taking measurements. He spoke as if his demands were absolute law, treating my childhood bedroom as nothing more than undeveloped real estate ripe for his immediate acquisition. My mother, Valerie, did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She placed her dessert spoon down on the fine china saucer, folded her hands together, and smiled radiantly at her son-in-law. "That is an absolutely brilliant idea, Preston," she gushed, her voice dripping with absolute sickening adoration. We want you to feel completely at home here. You need your dedicated space to continue building Chloe's beautiful future and securing your empire. And frankly, the timing is absolutely perfect. Valerie turned her gaze slowly toward me, and the warm maternal affection in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness. She looked at me, not as a devoted daughter who had just spent the last 2 months bathing her and tracking her severe pain medications, but as an inconvenient squatter occupying highly valuable real estate. Maya has completely overstayed her welcome, she announced to the entire table without a shred of remorse or basic human decency. My knee is healing perfectly, and she is clearly not doing anything productive with her life, sitting up there in that bedroom, all day, staring at a blank screen. It is high time she learned some real independence, instead of leeching off us indefinitely. Preston can take her bedroom starting this very weekend. Harrison nodded vigorously in agreement, thumping the heavy wooden table with his hand. Exactly, he barked, his face turning red with righteous indignation. We are completely done running a charity operation for a 35-year-old failure who refuses to accept minimum wage work when it is generously handed to her. You need to pack your things tonight, Maya. You can sleep on the living room sofa until morning, but I want you out of that room by noon tomorrow. We have to clear out all your useless junk so Preston can start moving his dual monitors and strategy whiteboards in before the weekend. Chloe giggled quietly, sipping her expensive red wine and whispering something into Preston's ear, who smirked triumphantly back at her. They were publicly evicting me from my childhood home, tossing me out into the unforgiving streets simply because Preston wanted a quiet place to take fake investor calls on a Saturday afternoon. I looked at Valerie, the woman whose swollen, surgically repaired legs I had carefully wrapped in fresh ice packs just 4 hours ago. I had spent that very morning helping her learn how to navigate the staircase, supporting her entire body weight so she would not fall. She did not look away or show an ounce of shame. She held my gaze with absolute, unapologetic cruelty, proud of her decision to prioritize an arrogant fraud over her own devoted flesh and blood. She genuinely believed she was discarding a heavy burden, finally purging her perfect home of the one daughter who refused to conform to her shallow societal expectations. The sheer coldness of her delivery was breathtakingly cruel, cementing the absolute death of any lingering familial loyalty I might have harbored deep within my soul. The profound, staggering irony of this exact moment hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. I stood perfectly still, looking at the four of them as they excitedly began discussing ergonomic desk chairs and soundproofing panels for Preston's new executive suite. They were casually plotting to evict me from the premises, with zero regard for my survival, discussing my displacement as if I were nothing more than an obsolete piece of furniture. What they did not know, what they could never possibly comprehend with their incredibly limited superficial intellects, was that I actually owned the very walls they were currently planning to paint slate gray. 2 years ago, before Valerie's knee surgery, before Chloe even married Preston, my parents had found themselves in a catastrophic financial crisis. Harrison had made a series of incredibly foolish, aggressive investments in a highly volatile commercial real estate venture, trying desperately to impress his wealthy country club associates. The venture collapsed spectacularly, wiping out his entire retirement savings and plunging them into massive, toxic debt. They had fallen 6 full months behind on their mortgage payments. The bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on this exact house. They were exactly 3 weeks away from having their expensive furniture thrown onto the front lawn by the local sheriff's department. I remember watching Harrison sprint to the mailbox every single afternoon, desperately trying to intercept the bright red bank notices before his nosy neighbors could see them. They kept their impending ruin a desperate, humiliating secret from everyone, especially from Chloe, because admitting absolute financial ruin would permanently destroy their precious social standing. But my grandfather Thomas had made me the executor of his small estate before he passed, and I still had access to the legal channels that monitored our family assets. I saw the aggressive foreclosure notice when it was officially filed. Instead of letting them face the brutal public humiliation they feared vastly more than death, I quietly stepped in. I did not do it for their love. I did it to honor the memory of my grandfather, who built the foundation of this family. Using an anonymous blind trust managed by my elite corporate legal team at Auratech, I paid off their entire remaining mortgage balance in a single massive wire transfer. I cleared their debts, completely neutralizing the bank's threat within 24 hours. I bought the house outright and quietly transferred the property deed to my subsidiary holding company. I allowed them to continue living here under a lifetime rent-free lease arrangement that my father arrogantly believed was a miraculous administrative clerical error by the incompetent bank. He thought his sheer luck had beaten the system. He had absolutely no idea that his useless failure of a daughter was actually his highly generous landlord. And now this arrogant man and his cruel wife were forcefully kicking the actual legal owner of the property out onto the street just to build an office for a manipulative con artist. I did not blink. I did not shed a single tear or utter a word of protest. I just absorbed the absolute poetry of their massive fatal mistake, securely locking it away in my mental ledger for the magnificent financial and emotional destruction that was about to come. The silence in the dining room was shattered by the sharp scrape of my wooden chair pushing away from the table. I stood up smoothly, smoothing the front of my simple, unbranded linen trousers. I did not scream or throw my water glass. I simply nodded, accepting their vicious eviction with the absolute tranquility of a woman who held their entire financial existence in the palm of her hand. I turned to walk toward the staircase to pack my duffel bag, intending to leave them to their miserable delusions. But my mother Valerie was not quite finished extracting her pound of flesh. She held up her hand, signaling for me to stop right there in the doorway. "If you are leaving this house tonight, Maya, we need to settle your outstanding debts," she announced, her voice echoing with a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured business acumen. "You have been occupying a premium room in this house for 60 days. You have consumed our electricity, used our water, and eaten the groceries in our refrigerator. If you want to finally learn how the real world operates, you need to understand that housing is not free." I paused, resting my hand on the smooth mahogany doorframe. I turned slowly to face the woman whose surgical scars I had meticulously cleaned just yesterday morning. "You are asking me to pay rent?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely devoid of the blinding rage that would have consumed a lesser person. "You are asking for financial compensation for the privilege of serving as your unpaid round-the-clock medical caregiver while your other daughter refused to lift a single finger to help you." Harrison immediately jumped to his wife's defense, his chest puffed out in a display of aggressive patriarchal authority. "Do not you dare try to spin this into a guilt trip, Maya," he barked, pointing a rigid finger at my face. "You needed a place to stay because you are a 35-year-old failure with absolutely zero prospects. We provided you with a roof over your head. Preston pays a premium for his luxury condo downtown, and he is out there hustling every single day. The absolute least you can do is reimburse us for the massive financial burden you have placed on this family during your mother's recovery." Preston leaned back in his chair, swirling the dregs of his expensive red wine, looking thoroughly entertained by the domestic dispute he had engineered. "It is just basic economics, Maya," he chimed in, offering a patronizing little smirk. "You cannot expect to scale your life if you are constantly relying on subsidies from your parents. Think of it as your first lesson in real-world fiscal responsibility." I looked at Preston, taking in his tailored suit and his arrogant posture. I thought about the catastrophic debt his failing tech startup was currently drowning in. He was lecturing me on fiscal responsibility while secretly leveraging my parents' home, the very home I legally owned, to save his own sinking ship. The comedic value of his profound ignorance was almost too much to bear. "How much do you believe I owe you for my stay?" I asked, directing my question back to Valerie. Valerie pursed her lips, pretending to calculate the mental arithmetic of my supposed burden. "Given the current market rate for a room in this neighborhood and the utilities you have consumed, I believe $5,000 is a highly generous family discount." $5,000. She was extorting her own daughter for $5,000 after I had saved her thousands in professional nursing fees. I nodded slowly, processing the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I did not argue. I did not remind them that I had personally purchased every single grocery item in their refrigerator for the past 2 months. I simply walked upstairs to the bedroom that Preston was so desperate to claim. I packed my few personal belongings into my heavy canvas duffel bag, making sure I left absolutely nothing behind. Then I reached into the hidden zippered compartment of my laptop bag and pulled out a simple blue checkbook. This specific checkbook was not linked to the massive corporate holding accounts of Oratech. It was not connected to my high-yield investment portfolios or the anonymous trust that held the deed to my parents' house. It was tied to a secondary low-balance decoy account I maintained exclusively for trivial everyday expenses, like gas, groceries, and minor monthly subscriptions. It was the absolute financial equivalent of spare change. I walked back down the staircase, the heavy duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and the checkbook firmly in my hand. I stepped into the dining room, where the four of them were still sitting, clearly waiting to see if I would actually produce the funds or if I would break down crying and beg for mercy. I placed the checkbook on the corner of the dining table, clicked my pen, and wrote out a check to Harrison for exactly $5,000. My handwriting was steady, precise, and completely unapologetic. I tore the check from the ledger and slid it across the polished wood toward my father. Harrison snatched it up, inspecting the signature and the amount with greedy satisfaction. He handed it to Preston, who inspected the small piece of paper as if it were a fascinating artifact from a lesser civilization. Preston let out a loud, barking laugh, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. $5,000, he chuckled, tossing the check back onto the table. I cannot believe you actually wrote it. That has to be your entire life savings, Maya. What are you going to do now? Go live in a cardboard box on the side of the highway. I really hope you did not just bankrupt your little internet hobby just to pay your parents back. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Seriously, Maya, you should have just apologized to Mom and Dad. Now you are literally going to be penniless on the street. We cannot bail you out when you inevitably run out of gas money tomorrow morning. I looked at the check resting on the table. $5,000 was roughly what my company generated in pure profit every 14 minutes of the business day. Preston was sitting there laughing at what he assumed was my absolute financial ruin, completely unaware that his own company was weeks away from total annihilation. I let them enjoy their petty, vicious victory. I let them believe they had successfully drained my non-existent poverty-stricken bank account. Their arrogant assumptions were the perfect camouflage for the devastating corporate strike I was actively preparing to launch. The transaction was complete. The final agonizing debt of my childhood had been paid in full. I reached down and grabbed the thick canvas strap of my duffel bag, hoisting it firmly onto my shoulder. The weight of the bag grounded me, connecting me to the physical reality of the moment. I stood at the edge of the dining room, making a deliberate, conscious choice to look at each of them one last time. I looked at Chloe, my golden sister who measured her entire self-worth by the designer logos on her handbag and the fraudulent success of her husband. I looked at Preston, the arrogant parasite who was actively destroying my parents' financial future while demanding their absolute worship. I looked at Harrison, the father who valued country club status far more than his own flesh and blood. And finally, I looked at Valerie, the mother who had gladly extorted the daughter who nursed her back to health. I cemented their toxic, sneering faces permanently into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly how they looked in this moment of supreme manufactured triumph. I wanted to freeze this image in time so that when they eventually came crawling to me, begging for financial salvation, I would never feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. This was the family I was born into, but it was no longer the family I belonged to. I turned my back on them and walked toward the front door. The heavy mahogany door swung open, letting in the thick, oppressive heat of the Georgia summer evening. I stepped out onto the porch, my posture perfectly straight, my head held high. Behind me, the dam broke. Now that I was actually leaving, Harrison felt the sudden, desperate need to assert his absolute dominance one last time. "Go live in the streets," he yelled, his voice chasing me down the porch steps. "You are nothing but a useless failure. Do not come crying to us when you realize how hard the real world actually is." Valerie called out from the doorway, her voice harsh and unrelenting. "You brought this entirely on yourself, Maya. You are 35 years old with absolutely nothing to show for it. I ignored their desperate, cruel insults. The words washed over my back like harmless raindrops bouncing off reinforced steel. I walked down the concrete driveway toward my reliable 5-year-old sedan. I did not rush. I did not display a single microscopic fraction of the fear or devastation they so desperately wanted to witness. I unlocked my car, tossed my duffel bag onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see Preston standing on the porch, holding a glass of wine, smirking, as he watched the useless failure finally retreat from his newly conquered territory. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a final patronizing salute to his own fabricated brilliance. I started the engine, the quiet, dependable hum of the motor filling the cabin of the car. I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not shed a tear. The house, the toxicity, the years of suffocating disrespect, they were all behind me now, permanently shrinking into the distance. The heavy, suffocating chains of my familial obligation had been completely severed by their own greedy hands. They had demanded my departure. They had demanded my money. They had demanded my absolute humiliation. But as I drove through the quiet, manicured streets of their suburban neighborhood, a genuine, powerful smile broke across my face. They thought they had discarded a burden. They had absolutely no idea they had just unleashed a titan. The countdown had officially begun, and they were entirely unprepared for the sheer magnitude of the storm that was about to hit their perfectly curated glass house. I navigated the familiar winding streets of the subdivision for exactly 3 blocks before I engaged my turn signal and pulled the sedan over to the curb. I shifted the car into park under the flickering amber glow of a solitary street lamp. For a full minute, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel. I let the silence of the vehicle wrap around me. There were no silver bells ringing. There were no loud demands for ironed shirts. There were no harsh voices reminding me of my supposed failures. There was only the quiet hum of my engine and the rhythmic beating of my own heart. I took a deep breath, pulling the cool air into my lungs, and as I exhaled, the beaten-down, dutiful daughter officially ceased to exist. I reached into my center console and picked up my phone. I bypassed the personal contacts list and opened my encrypted corporate communication channel. I pressed the speed dial for Keisha, my executive assistant. She answered on the very first ring, her voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. "Keisha?" I said, my voice dropping an octave, shedding the soft, compliant tone I had been forced to use for the past 60 days. The tone I used now was the exact voice that terrified shipping executives across 3 continents. "The domestic assignment is permanently concluded. I need you to initiate protocol for my immediate return to full operational capacity." Keisha did not ask a single unnecessary question. She was a brilliant, highly compensated professional who understood my life required absolute discretion and flawless execution. "Understood, Maya?" She replied, her fingers already flying across a keyboard in the background. "What are your immediate logistical requirements?" I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I needed a physical environment that matched my actual tax bracket. I needed space to breathe and strategize. "Book the presidential penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton downtown," I instructed. "Secure it for the next 14 days. I do not care what the nightly rate is, but ensure it is billed to my personal holding account, not the corporate expense card. Have the hotel concierge arrange for a full executive wardrobe delivery by tomorrow morning." I left my entire professional closet at my private residence, and I do not have the patience to retrieve it. I need 3 bespoke power suits, crisp blouses, and appropriate footwear waiting in the suite. Use my standard measurements on file. "Consider it done," Keisha confirmed efficiently. "I will contact the hotel general manager directly to ensure absolute privacy during your stay. Your suite will be ready by the time you arrive. Do you need me to adjust your morning schedule for tomorrow?" "No," I replied, shifting the car back into drive. "Leave the schedule exactly as it stands. I will be leading the global supply chain optimization meeting at 8 sharp. Send the updated financial projections to my secure tablet. I am back online." I ended the call and merged back onto the main road. The transition was complete. I was no longer the tragic spinster sister living on charity. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Oratech, and I was going home. The drive into downtown Atlanta was a masterclass in psychological recalibration. As I merged onto the highway, the sprawling manicured lawns of my parents' restrictive suburban neighborhood gave way to the soaring illuminated skyscrapers of the city. The towering glass and steel structures represented commerce power and the exact environment where I truly belonged. I pulled my unassuming silver sedan up to the brilliantly lit valet stand at the Ritz-Carlton. The valet, a young man in a pristine uniform, jogged over and opened my door. He did not judge my modest vehicle. He simply offered a polite professional greeting and handed me a claim ticket. A bellhop immediately stepped forward to retrieve my heavy canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, holding the worn fabric with the same careful respect he would offer a set of custom luxury luggage. I walked through the grand sliding glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, opulent lobby. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and polished marble. The front desk manager was already waiting for me, holding a heavy brass keycard. "Welcome to the Ritz-Carlton, Miss Maya," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Your executive assistant informed us of your arrival. The penthouse suite has been fully prepared for you. We have arranged for absolute discretion during your stay. If you require anything at all, please do not hesitate to ask." I nodded my thanks and followed the private elevator attendant to the highest floor of the building. When the heavy wooden double doors of the penthouse swung open, I stepped into a realm of staggering, unapologetic luxury. The suite cost $5,000 a single night, and every inch of the space justified the extravagant price tag. The living area featured soaring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire glittering Atlanta skyline. A massive crystal chandelier hung above a custom dining table. The furnishings were wrapped in rich velvet and supple leather. I walked across the plush carpets, leaving the bellhop a generous tip before he quietly exited and closed the door behind him. I was entirely alone in a palace in the sky. I carried my duffel bag into the master bathroom. The space was a massive sanctuary of white marble featuring a deep soaking tub and a sprawling glass-enclosed rainfall shower. I turned the polished chrome handles, letting the water run until the room filled with thick, warm steam. I stripped off the simple beige blouse and the plain linen trousers I had worn to cook my parents' lavish dinner. I dropped the clothes onto the marble floor, feeling a profound sense of disgust at the fabric. Those clothes smelled of roasted prime rib and the stifling antiseptic odor of my mother's recovery room. They smelled of subservience. I stepped into the sprawling shower and let the scalding hot water wash over my skin. I stood directly beneath the heavy rainfall showerhead, closing my eyes as the water cascaded down my shoulders and back. I grabbed a bottle of expensive eucalyptus body wash and scrubbed my skin with aggressive, determined motions. I was not just washing away the physical sweat of cooking and cleaning. I was actively scrubbing away the toxic residue of my family. I washed away the heavy, suffocating weight of my father's screaming insults. I washed away the bitter, lingering sting of my mother's cruel eviction. I washed away the sickening memory of Preston's arrogant laughter and Chloe's condescending smirk. I stood in the stinging hot water until my skin turned pink, until my muscles completely relaxed, until my mind was entirely purged of their poisonous influence. For the first time in 60 grueling days, I was not anticipating the sharp, demanding ring of a silver bell. I was completely untouchable. I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a thick, plush white hotel robe. The terry cloth was warm and heavy, providing a comforting physical boundary between myself and the outside world. I walked over to the complimentary wet bar and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling mineral water, adding a fresh slice of lemon. I carried the cool glass across the sprawling living room and unlatched the heavy sliding glass doors that led out to the private penthouse balcony. The warm, humid Georgia night air immediately enveloped me. I stepped out onto the wide stone terrace, resting my forearms against the cool metal railing. Hundreds of feet below me, the city of Atlanta was alive with motion. The headlights of thousands of cars formed winding rivers of bright light, navigating the complex concrete arteries of the downtown grid. I looked down at the massive, intricate logistical network of the city and felt a deep, familiar sense of absolute control. This was my domain. This was a world of data movement and undeniable facts. Standing there looking out over the sprawling illuminated metropolis, the final massive wave of emotional release finally hit me. It was not a wave of sorrow. I did not shed a single tear for the family I had just lost. Instead, it was a profound, overwhelming tidal wave of pure, unadulterated liberation. The pain of being unloved by the people who created you is a very specific type of chronic invisible agony. For 35 years, I had carried that dull, aching pain inside my chest. I had constantly twisted my own personality, trying desperately to decipher the exact magical formula that would finally make Harrison and Valerie look at me with pride. I had analyzed my own behavior constantly, wondering why my quiet intelligence was deemed worthless, while Chloe's loud superficiality was heavily rewarded. I had spent decades internalizing the belief that I was fundamentally flawed because my own parents treated me like a regrettable mistake. But out here, standing on the precipice of my own undeniable triumph, I finally accepted the absolute truth. The flaw was never in me. The flaw was entirely in them. They were emotionally bankrupt people who worshipped empty status and fabricated wealth. They were completely incapable of experiencing genuine, unconditional love. Recognizing their severe limitations was the key to my permanent freedom. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cold, sparkling water, letting the crisp liquid soothe my throat. The suffocating familial guilt I had carried for my entire adult life completely evaporated into the humid night air. I no longer owed them my time. I no longer owed them my quiet obedience. I no longer owed them my financial protection. By forcefully kicking me out of their home to accommodate an arrogant fraud, they had permanently severed the invisible contractual obligations of our family tree. They had fired their most devoted, loyal employee. And in doing so, they had unknowingly handed me the exact permission I needed to become their absolute worst nightmare. I looked at the glittering skyscrapers rising into the dark sky, and I smiled. My mental ledger was closed. The data collection phase of my operation was completely finished. The time for silent observation was officially over. I turned around and walked back into the luxurious, climate-controlled comfort of the penthouse suite, letting the heavy glass door slide shut behind me. I set my glass down on the marble counter and opened my secure, encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated my face with a bright, cool glow. I had a multi-million-dollar global logistics empire to run and a very specific, highly targeted corporate trap to build. 2 weeks. That was exactly how long I calculated it would take for Preston's fraudulent house of cards to begin its spectacular, catastrophic collapse. And when he finally hit the ground, I would be standing right there waiting for him. The next 14 days were an absolute masterclass in corporate acceleration and profound personal peace. I transitioned out of the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton and moved back into my actual primary residence, a sprawling modern penthouse loft located in the very heart of Buckhead. It was a massive space designed entirely for my comfort and efficiency, featuring stark minimalist architecture, massive walls of tinted glass, and absolutely zero reminders of my toxic family. Returning to the physical global headquarters of Oratech felt like breathing pure oxygen after spending 2 months suffocating underwater in that suburban prison. Walking onto the main executive floor of my building, I was immediately greeted by the sharp, productive hum of my brilliant staff. My chief operating officer had seamlessly executed the massive European logistics expansion during my brief domestic captivity. Our server capacity was scaling perfectly. Our algorithmic routing efficiency had improved by another 4%, and our quarterly profit margins were soaring far past our most aggressive internal projections. I spent my days dominating high-level strategy meetings, reviewing complex global data streams, and guiding my company toward an unprecedented level of industry dominance. I completely blocked my parents and my sister on all of my personal communication platforms. I did not care if they were struggling to manage Valerie's physical therapy without their unpaid servant. I did not care if my father was throwing immature tantrums because nobody was there to press his golf shirts. I was entirely inaccessible. I was operating at the absolute peak of my mental and professional capabilities. I was thriving in the exact environment they had so cruelly mocked. While I was steadily building a massive global empire, Preston was actively watching his flimsy house of cards completely disintegrate. I did not even have to actively seek out information about the catastrophic collapse of his company. The tech industry in Atlanta is an incredibly small, highly connected ecosystem where massive, arrogant failures echo very loudly through the corporate grapevine. It started as quiet, concerned whispers among local venture capitalists and quickly escalated into a full-blown corporate panic. Preston had spent the last 2 years aggressively marketing himself as a visionary genius, but the brutal, unforgiving reality of business math was finally catching up to his lies. He had absolutely zero viable product to sell. His highly publicized cloud-native disruption was nothing more than a poorly coded, unscalable database, wrapped in a highly expensive marketing campaign. He had secured his initial round of seed funding by charming naive local investors with his perfectly tailored Italian suits and his aggressive, arrogant pitch decks. But investors eventually demand to see actual revenue, and Preston was bleeding cash at an absolutely catastrophic rate. He had signed a massive 5-year commercial lease for a flashy midtown office space that he simply could not afford to maintain. He had hired a bloated staff of useless executives who spent their days drinking artisan coffee and contributing absolutely nothing to the operational back end of the business. As the weeks dragged on, the quiet whispers in the financial sector turned into angry, demanding shouts. His primary investors had officially realized they were being scammed by a smooth-talking fraud. They initiated a sudden, aggressive forensic audit of NovaFlow's internal financial records. What the seasoned auditors uncovered was not just standard startup incompetence, it was deliberate, malicious corporate fraud. Preston had been actively commingling corporate investment funds with his own personal bank accounts. He was illegally using investor money to fund his extravagant lifestyle with Chloe. He had used company capital to lease her pristine white BMW to pay for their high-end dinners at exclusive steakhouses and to maintain the absolute illusion of his elite social status. The developers he had hired were quitting in droves because their paychecks were bouncing. The expensive espresso machines in his lobby were actively being repossessed by angry vendors. His entire operation was crashing down around him and the walls were closing in fast. But the financial mismanagement and the blatant embezzlement were only the tip of the terrifying iceberg. The most shocking and utterly devastating piece of intelligence arrived on my desk on a crisp Tuesday morning exactly 2 weeks after my father had thrown me out of his house. My senior acquisitions director, a brilliant, highly connected analyst named David, walked into my corner office and handed me a thick, confidential financial dossier. David knew I casually monitored local logistics startups to scout for potential software patents, and he thought I might find this particular implosion professionally amusing. I opened the heavy manila folder and began scanning the highly sensitive financial documents. What I saw on the third page of the audit summary made my blood run absolutely ice cold before a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. Preston, in a desperate, frantic attempt to keep his failing company afloat and hide his massive embezzlement from the angry auditors, had secured an emergency predatory bridge loan from a highly aggressive private equity firm. The loan was for exactly $3 million. But a private equity firm does not just hand over $3 million in rescue capital to a failing startup without massive ironclad collateral. Preston did not own his luxury condo, he rented it. He did not own his cars, he leased them. He had absolutely zero personal assets to leverage against a loan of that magnitude. So he used the only major physical asset he had access to. He had used my parents' house. I read through the heavily redacted loan origination documents, my mind putting the horrific pieces together with crystal clarity. My father, Harrison, had always been completely blinded by his worship of Preston. Harrison trusted Preston so implicitly that he had clearly signed over financial power of attorney or co-signed the bridge loan documents without ever bothering to read the fine print. Preston had undoubtedly convinced my arrogant, foolish father that this was just a temporary administrative requirement to help NovaFlow scale its global operations. He probably fed Harrison some lie about making him an official angel investor or a senior board member. Harrison, desperate to be closely associated with a tech billionaire, had gladly offered up the deed to his suburban home as collateral for the massive loan. The sheer sickening irony of the situation was almost too brilliant for a Hollywood script. Preston had leveraged the house to secure his desperate loan. But Preston and Harrison had absolutely no idea that the bank did not actually own that house. I owned that house. The anonymous blind trust I controlled was the actual legal entity holding the property deed. Preston had essentially committed massive federal wire fraud by leveraging a property he did not legally possess the rights to encumber, and the private equity firm had failed to properly verify the chain of title due to the rushed, desperate nature of the fraudulent transaction. Now the predatory loan had officially defaulted. The private equity firm was actively demanding their $3 million, and Preston had absolutely zero capital to pay them back. The dominoes were lined up in a perfectly lethal row. If Preston did not secure an immediate massive corporate buyout to cover the defaulted loan and pay back his angry, defrauded investors, he was going to be indicted by the federal government for wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate malfeasance. He was staring down the very real barrel of a 10 to 15-year federal prison sentence. And because Harrison had foolishly attached his name to the fraudulent bridge loan documents, my parents were going to be dragged down right alongside him. They were going to lose the house they thought they owned. They were going to lose their pristine neighborhood reputation. They were going to face absolute total public ruin in front of the very community they had spent their entire lives trying to impress. I sat back in my plush leather executive chair, gently closing the manila folder. I looked out the massive glass windows of my office, watching the morning traffic flow through the busy streets of Atlanta. My parents had kicked me out into the street to build a home office for a man who had secretly stolen their entire financial future. They had called me a useless failure while aggressively protecting the very parasite that was actively destroying their lives. The trap had been set and triggered entirely by their own blinding arrogance and greed. The only possible way Preston could avoid federal prison and save my parents from absolute destitution was to sell NovaFlow immediately. He needed a larger, established corporate entity to acquire his toxic company, absorb his massive debts, and pay off the predatory loan before the federal authorities were officially notified. He was desperate. He was backed into an inescapable corner. And I was the exact only person in the entire city with the liquid capital, the logistics infrastructure, and the absolute ruthless desire to buy him out. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, watching the morning sunlight filter through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office. David, my senior acquisitions director, walked back into the room holding a sleek, black leather portfolio. We had discussed the preliminary audit of NovaFlow earlier, but now he was bringing me their official desperate plea for salvation. David sat across from me and slid the portfolio across my desk. He explained that Preston's corporate brokers were aggressively pitching a distressed asset buyout to every major tech logistics firm in the southeastern United States. They were practically giving the company away for pennies on the dollar just to cover the catastrophic debt liabilities. The brokers were promising massive proprietary tech assets, but David had already verified that their code was essentially worthless. They were selling a sinking ship and trying to disguise it as a luxury yacht. The financial spreadsheets attached behind his photograph were a bloodbath of red ink showing massive negative cash flow and fabricated user engagement metrics that bordered on comedic. I opened the black leather folder. The very first page of the executive summary featured a high-resolution professional headshot of Preston. He was wearing the exact same custom-tailored Italian silk shirt I had meticulously ironed for him just 14 days ago. In the photograph, he was projecting his usual arrogant tech visionary persona, his chin tilted upward in an expression of supreme, unearned confidence. But looking at the brutal financial spreadsheets attached behind his photograph, I knew the terrifying reality he was currently living. That arrogant smirk, was nothing more than a desperately painted mask hiding a man who was actively suffocating under the crushing weight of impending federal fraud charges. David leaned forward and asked if we should simply toss the proposal in the shredder. He pointed out that acquiring a toxic asset like NovaFlow offered absolutely zero operational value to Oratech. From a purely strategic standpoint, buying Preston's failing company was a massive waste of our corporate resources. I looked down at Preston's photograph, tracing the edge of the glossy paper with my index finger. I did not speak for a long moment, letting the absolute gravity of the situation wash over me. David was entirely correct about the business metrics. NovaFlow was garbage. But David did not know the personal history attached to that smug face staring up from the dossier. He did not know that the man begging for a corporate bailout was the exact same parasite who had convinced my parents to throw me out into the street. I closed the folder with a sharp, decisive snap. I told David to keep the file on my desk because we were going to move forward with the acquisition. David looked at me in shock, clearly questioning my sanity, but he was a seasoned professional who knew better than to argue when my tone shifted into absolute final authority. Once David left the office, I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The incredible, staggering, karmic realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sheer poetry of the universe was almost too beautiful to comprehend. Exactly 14 days ago, I was standing on a dusty suburban porch, holding a heavy canvas duffel bag. My father Harrison was screaming in my face, calling me a useless 35-year-old failure who had absolutely nothing to show for her life. My mother Valerie was looking at me with pure disgust, demanding that I pay her $5,000 in back rent for the privilege of nursing her through her surgical recovery. They had looked at me as if I were the absolute lowest form of human life on the planet. They had proudly chosen a smooth-talking con artist over their own devoted flesh and blood. They had violently kicked me out of my childhood home and told me to go live in the streets, just so Preston could have a quiet room to take his fraudulent investor calls. And now, in a short span of time, the cosmic scales had balanced with precision. The very people who had ruthlessly discarded me were now unknowingly dropping to their knees and begging my company for their financial salvation. They were begging for their lives. Without a massive corporate buyout, Preston was going straight to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. Without this exact acquisition, Harrison and Valerie were going to lose the house they had illegally leveraged and face total public ruin in front of their precious country club friends. Their entire existence rested completely on the stroke of my pen. I thought about the decoy check I had written to my father. That $5,000 check he had snatched up with such greedy, pathetic satisfaction, while Preston laughed at my supposed poverty. They thought they had drained my entire life savings. They had absolutely no idea that their entire future was currently sitting in a black leather folder on my desk, waiting for me to pass judgment. The contrast between my current reality and the miserable existence they tried to force upon me was staggering. I was sitting in a custom leather chair overlooking the sprawling Atlanta skyline while they were sweating over their impending doom. The immense power of the moment was intoxicating. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or familial obligation. I did not feel the urge to swoop in and save them from the catastrophic mess they had intentionally created. They had made their choices with absolute arrogance and cruel intent. Now they were going to face the brutal consequences. The universe had delivered my enemies directly to my doorstep. I was not going to simply reject their proposal and let them quietly fail. I was going to construct a flawless, inescapable trap. I was going to make them look their failure right in the eye. I was going to force them to realize exactly who they had thrown away. I picked up my secure desk phone and pressed the direct line to my executive assistant, Keisha. I instructed her to immediately summon David back to my office along with our lead corporate attorney. When they arrived, I laid out the precise parameters of the acquisition strategy. I commanded them not to use the Oratech name in the preliminary negotiations. Preston was desperate, but he was a fragile narcissist who might panic if a massive industry titan looked too closely at his fraudulent books. More importantly, my family knew I worked in logistics and I could not risk Chloe or Harrison accidentally recognizing my company name and spoiling the surprise. I directed my legal team to use one of our completely anonymous subsidiary holding companies, Apex Vanguard Solutions, to initiate the buyout offer. Apex Vanguard was a legitimate corporate entity with a flawless financial record, but its executive structure was shielded behind multiple layers of corporate privacy laws. Preston would see a wealthy, faceless corporate savior reaching down from the heavens to pull him out of the fire. I told David to offer a highly aggressive timeline. I wanted the entire acquisition fast-tracked and pushed to the final signature phase within 72 hours. We would offer to absorb his company completely, pay off the predatory bridge loan that was threatening my parents' house, and provide Preston with a small face-saving exit bonus. It was exactly the kind of miraculous golden parachute a desperate fraudster would blindly lunge for without reading the fine print. I instructed my team to frame the invitation as an exclusive elite opportunity, playing directly to Preston's massive ego so he would feel important rather than investigated. But I had one absolute stipulation for the deal. I looked directly at my lead attorney and made my demands crystal clear. The final acquisition documents could not be signed digitally. They could not be processed through remote legal proxies. I mandated that the founder of NovaFlow and his primary financial guarantors must be physically present in our corporate boardroom for the final execution of the contract. I required Harrison and Valerie to attend the meeting under the guise of releasing the lien on their property. I framed it to my legal team as a strict corporate compliance measure to ensure all debt liabilities were properly acknowledged by the guarantors in person. My team accepted the condition as a standard aggressive corporate maneuver. They had absolutely no idea they were actively setting the stage for a family reckoning of epic proportions. David immediately drafted the highly aggressive letter of intent from Apex Vanguard Solutions. Keisha began diligently preparing the main executive boardroom for a high-stakes acquisition meeting scheduled for Friday morning. I sat back watching my brilliant team execute my flawless trap. Preston, Harrison, and Valerie were about to walk blindly into my building, step into my boardroom, and finally face the useless failure who secretly owned their entire world. While I sat in the absolute tranquility of my pristine corner office sipping hot matcha, the reality inside my parents' suburban home was rapidly devolving into pure, unadulterated chaos. I did not need a hidden camera to know exactly how their morning was unfolding because my acquisitions team had been fielding Preston's frantic, panicked emails since 4 in the morning. He had sent no less than 6 messages begging for reassurance that the bridge loan would be paid off immediately upon the final signature. He was sweating bullets, completely terrified that the massive private equity firm was going to seize his assets before the sun went down. Through my investigative team, I knew Chloe had spent the last 48 hours in a state of absolute superficial terror. The leasing company had already sent a final warning notice about her pristine white BMW, and the brutal realization that her designer lifestyle was actively evaporating had sent her into a massive emotional tailspin. She was completely terrified of losing her country club status, her expensive weekly manicures, and the artificial affluent image she had so carefully curated for her social media followers. She was facing the very real possibility of having to get a real job, and the prospect was mentally destroying her. Harrison and Valerie were equally panicked, but their deeply ingrained toxic arrogance absolutely refused to let them accept the stark truth of their desperate situation. They were staring directly down the barrel of imminent homelessness, yet they absolutely refused to hold Preston accountable for his criminal negligence. In their rigidly delusional minds, Preston was not a criminal fraudster who had illegally leveraged their property to fund his vanity project. He was simply a misunderstood tech genius who had temporarily hit a minor rough patch in an unforgiving market. They convinced themselves that the massive corporate entity reaching out to buy NovaFlow was ultimate proof of his unmatched brilliance. Harrison had undoubtedly spent the entire morning adjusting his favorite pastel golf shirt, telling Valerie that this elite acquisition was going to make them richer and more powerful than ever before. They clung aggressively to the desperate fantasy that Apex Vanguard Solutions recognized Preston's visionary talent and was stepping in to elevate him to the billionaire status he rightfully deserved. They were so entirely blinded by their relentless greed and their desperate need for societal validation that they never once stopped to question why a multinational holding company was so incredibly eager to bail out a completely worthless logistics startup that possessed zero viable software code. They packaged their blinding fear into a false sense of superiority, preparing to walk into a corporate boardroom and demand the respect they felt they were owed. At exactly 9:45 in the morning, my security director notified me that their vehicle had officially entered the primary parking garage of my corporate headquarters. I turned my attention to the large high-definition monitors mounted on my office wall, switching the display to the live security camera feeds. I watched with profound, cold satisfaction as Chloe's leased BMW pulled up to the grand front plaza of my building. The Tech Tower is a sprawling 50-story monument of blue reflective glass and brushed steel dominating the absolute center of the upscale business district. It is an architectural masterpiece that screams absolute institutional power and unapologetic wealth. I had intentionally chosen a building that intimidated anyone who walked through its doors to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. I watched the screens intently as the four of them stepped out of the vehicle. The sheer intimidation was immediate and visible even through the silent security cameras. Harrison craned his neck upward, staring at the towering skyscraper with his mouth hanging slightly open. He had spent his entire career working in a mediocre regional bank branch, and the sheer magnificent scale of my corporate fortress was clearly overwhelming his fragile masculine ego. He tried to puff out his chest and stand tall, but his posture betrayed his deep insecurities. Chloe stepped out onto the polished marble plaza, clutching her expensive designer handbag like a protective shield against the massive city infrastructure. She looked around nervously, suddenly realizing that her suburban country club aesthetic was entirely inadequate in the face of actual global wealth and corporate power. Valerie leaned heavily on her aluminum walker, her eyes darting around the immaculate landscaping and the sharp-tailored security personnel patrolling the perimeter with quiet authority. Preston tried his absolute hardest to project the aura of a confident, seasoned tech founder, but he looked like a terrified amateur wearing a suit he could not actually afford. He adjusted his collar aggressively, attempting to stride purposefully toward the massive revolving glass doors, but his gait was stiff and unnatural. I watched as they walked through the grand entrance into the sprawling main lobby. The lobby features imported Italian marble floors, a cascading 3-story indoor waterfall, and massive digital displays tracking global supply chain metrics in real time. They were completely out of their depth, swallowed whole by the staggering magnitude of the empire I had built from absolutely nothing. They stood in the center of the lobby, looking around like lost tourists trying to process the sheer volume of money required to maintain such an immaculate corporate environment. True to their deeply ingrained toxic nature, their overwhelming intimidation quickly mutated into defensive, aggressive arrogance. I switched the camera feed to the main reception desk, zooming in on the interaction to watch the psychology play out. Preston marched up to the front desk, attempting to look highly authoritative and important. He slapped his hand down on the marble counter and loudly announced to my lead receptionist that he was the brilliant founder of NovaFlow, here for a highly exclusive acquisition meeting with the chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard Solutions. My receptionist, a highly trained professional who handles international diplomats and global billionaires daily, simply smiled politely and asked for his photo identification to print his visitor badge. Preston immediately scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically and loudly complaining about the excessive, unnecessary security protocols. He acted as though his mere presence should have bypassed all standard corporate procedures, as if he were a celebrity whose face should be instantly recognized. Valerie tapped her foot impatiently, leaning heavily on her walker, and muttering audibly about the absolute lack of respect for important executive guests. Chloe crossed her arms, complaining to Harrison about the aggressive air conditioning in the lobby and whining that the receptionist was taking far too long to process their arrival. They were standing in the very heart of my empire, mere inches from total financial annihilation and federal prison, and they still could not summon a single ounce of basic human decency or humility. Their arrogance was truly a terminal disease. After meticulously verifying their credentials, my security team escorted them to the private executive elevator bank reserved exclusively for top-tier acquisitions and high-level board members. I watched the camera feed inside the elevator car as they rode up to the 50th floor. The silence between them in that enclosed space was thick with nervous, suffocating tension. Preston was visibly sweating, wiping his damp palms on his tailored trousers and swallowing hard. Harrison kept adjusting his silk tie, desperately trying to maintain his patriarchal authority, but his hands were slightly trembling. Valerie stared straight ahead, her face pale with the exertion of the trip and the underlying anxiety she refused to voice aloud. When the polished steel elevator doors finally opened onto the executive floor, they were met by Keisha, my flawless executive assistant. Keisha guided them down the wide, plushly carpeted hallway toward the primary executive boardroom. She moved with a sharp, confident grace that commanded absolute respect. The boardroom is a masterpiece of corporate intimidation and psychological warfare. It features a massive 30-foot solid oak conference table, sleek leather executive chairs, and floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offer a dizzying panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Keisha politely directed them to take their seats on one side of the massive table, informing them that the chief executive officer would be joining them shortly to finalize the acquisition. She placed 4 bottles of sparkling mineral water on the polished glass surface and exited the room, pulling the heavy soundproof wooden doors shut behind her. I sat back in my plush office chair, observing them through the hidden high-definition camera feed in the boardroom. They looked incredibly small and insignificant sitting at that massive, imposing table. Preston was bouncing his leg erratically against the floor, staring out at the city skyline with a look of desperate, trapped panic. He pulled out his phone, checking his emails obsessively, hoping for some last-minute miracle or reassurance. Harrison and Valerie were whispering to each other, their eyes darting around the luxurious room, taking in the expensive modern art and the sophisticated technological setup. Chloe was checking her reflection in her phone screen, aggressively reapplying her lip gloss to mask her deep terror. They were entirely unaware that the useless failure they had violently thrown into the streets just 14 days ago was currently watching their every single move, tracking their heart rates, and analyzing their profound desperation. The trap was perfectly set. The bait had been swallowed completely without a single second thought. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the sharp, elegant lines of my custom-tailored designer suit, and walked slowly toward the boardroom doors, completely ready to deliver the absolute destruction they had so richly earned. I reached the heavy frosted glass double doors of the main executive boardroom and paused for one single steadying breath. I smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored charcoal gray designer suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut razor-sharp, and it projected an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. I wore no jewelry aside from a sleek platinum watch on my left wrist, and my posture was perfectly straight, radiating the intense confidence of a woman who had fought Claude and built her way to the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world. I gave a subtle, tight nod to my lead corporate attorney and my brilliant executive assistant, Keisha, who stood flanking me like a highly trained elite corporate guard. Keisha reached out and pushed both of the massive doors open simultaneously. The heavy doors swung wide, revealing the expansive glass-walled room and the 4 utterly terrified individuals sitting at the far end of the massive oak conference table. I stepped across the threshold, my leather heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was sharp, commanding, and precise, cutting straight through the thick, nervous silence of the room like a blade. I did not smile. I did not offer a warm, familiar family greeting. I walked into that room with the cold, detached precision of an apex predator stepping into a sealed cage. My elite legal team fanned out behind me, taking their positions along the wall, their presence adding an impenetrable layer of institutional power and intimidation to my arrival. The atmospheric pressure in the boardroom shifted instantly. The air grew heavy and suffocating as the sheer, staggering weight of my corporate dominance flooded the space. I watched the exact moment the cognitive dissonance violently struck my family. Harrison was in the middle of taking a nervous sip from his sparkling water. He froze completely, the glass hovering mere inches from his mouth, his eyes bulging as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible image of his useless failure of a daughter striding into a high-stakes corporate acquisition meeting. Valerie gripped the arms of her expensive leather chair so tightly her knuckles turned stark white against her dark skin. Her jaw dropped completely open, but absolutely no sound emerged from her throat. Chloe physically recoiled, sinking deep back into her seat, as she took in the staggering obvious cost of my tailored suit, and the undeniable sheer power radiating from my stance. They were completely paralyzed, entirely incapable of reconciling the obedient unpaid maid they had violently kicked into the dirt, with the formidable executive currently commanding the entire room. But Preston, being a deeply fragile, arrogant narcissist, simply could not allow his fragile ego to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. His mind frantically searched for any logical explanation that preserved his fabricated superiority and his fragile worldview. He let out a loud, forced barking laugh that echoed awkwardly and terribly off the high glass walls. He stood up from his chair, attempting to project the relaxed confidence of a seasoned tech founder, but his hands were noticeably trembling against the glass table. Maya, he chuckled, his voice cracking slightly, betraying his deep internal panic. What on earth are you doing here? Did you manage to finally get a job as a coffee girl or an administrative assistant for the firm? Wow, they really will hire absolutely anyone to fetch water these days. Listen, sweetheart, this is a highly confidential corporate acquisition meeting for elite executives only. You need to run along back to the kitchen or the mailroom before you get fired for interrupting your bosses. Harrison immediately chimed in his face, turning a dangerous shade of red with acute embarrassment and sudden anger. He slammed his hand down on the table, trying to reclaim his lost power. Maya, get out of this room right now, he barked, attempting to assert his patriarchal authority in a space he did not own and could not comprehend. You are actively humiliating us in front of these corporate lawyers. We are waiting for the chief executive officer to arrive to save Preston's company. Go wait down in the lobby before you ruin this massive deal for your brother-in-law. You have absolutely no business being anywhere near a boardroom like this. Valerie found her voice nodding frantically in agreement with her husband. This is exactly why you are a complete failure, Maya, she hissed, leaning forward aggressively. You have absolutely no sense of professional boundaries. Go downstairs immediately and wait in the car. We will deal with this absurd behavior when we get home. I did not flinch. I did not acknowledge their pathetic, desperate commands. I simply ignored Preston's pathetic little joke, entirely walking with slow, deliberate, measured steps toward the massive leather chair positioned at the absolute head of the conference table. The chair reserved exclusively for the most powerful person in the room. I stood behind it for a fraction of a second, letting the silence stretch out and completely suffocate them. The quiet in the room was absolute, broken only by the shallow, terrified breathing of my sister Chloe, who was beginning to understand that something was catastrophically wrong. Then I sat down, crossing my legs smoothly and resting my hands flat on the polished glass surface. Keisha stepped forward with flawless professional grace and placed a thick, heavy black dossier directly in front of me. The loud, solid thud of the dossier hitting the glass table sounded like a judge bringing down a final crushing gavel determining their ultimate fate. I looked directly at Preston, pinning him to his seat, with a gaze so cold and incredibly hollow he physically shuddered under the intense scrutiny. I am not the coffee girl, Preston. I stated, my voice perfectly level, carrying the absolute unquestionable authority of a corporate titan, and I am most certainly not an administrative assistant. My name is Maya, and I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Aura Tech, the parent corporation that entirely controls the Apex Vanguard subsidiary holding company you have been begging for a bailout. The absolute silence that descended upon the boardroom was completely deafening. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of four arrogant, fragile realities, simultaneously shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The blood drained so rapidly from Preston's face that his skin took on a sickly, translucent gray pallor. He collapsed backward into his executive chair, the aggressive, confident posture completely vanishing as his knees literally gave out beneath the heavy table. His mouth opened and closed silently like a fish suffocating on dry land, unable to form a single coherent syllable. Harrison let out a strangled, gasping sound, clutching his chest, as if he were experiencing a sudden, profound medical emergency. His eyes darted frantically from me to the powerful legal team standing silently behind my chair, and then down to the thick black dossier resting securely under my hands. Valerie simply stared at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated primal terror, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of the mistake she had made exactly 14 days ago. She was looking at the daughter she had gleefully evicted, looking at the woman she had mercilessly extorted for $5,000, and realizing that this exact woman was the elusive billionaire savior they had been desperately waiting for. Chloe covered her mouth with her trembling manicured hands, shaking her head back and forth in rapid, aggressive denial, trying to physically reject the brutal truth that was currently destroying her entire superficial world. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the central air conditioning. "No, that is completely impossible. You play on a computer in your bedroom. You are broke. You drive a terrible old car. This has to be a sick joke." I opened the thick black dossier, flipping casually to the very first page, containing Preston's arrogant corporate headshot. I did not give them a single second to recover their breath or attempt to rationalize their profound terror. I leaned forward slightly, dominating the entire visual space of the room, and letting the full, devastating weight of my reality crash down upon them. "Let us dispense with the absolute fiction that you are a brilliant tech innovator, Preston." I continued, my tone surgically precise and utterly devoid of any familial warmth. "You are currently sitting in my building at my table drinking my sparkling mineral water. You are actively begging my corporation to acquire your completely worthless logistics startup. You offered me a $15 an hour data entry job out of the goodness of your heart," I reminded him, throwing his own condescending words right back in his face. "Let me provide you with a much clearer picture of the actual financial hierarchy currently operating in this room." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of my parents who were hanging onto my every single word with pathetic desperation. Last fiscal year, Oratech generated a net personal income for me of exactly $27 million. I possess more liquid capital in my secondary checking accounts than your fraudulent startup has generated in its entire miserable existence. I built a massive global logistics empire from my childhood bedroom while you were busy leeching off local angel investors to pay for your leased luxury cars and expensive office espresso machines. Harrison tried to speak, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of profound shock and desperate calculating greed. "Maya," he stammered, his knuckles turning white as he clutched the edge of the glass table. "Maya, honey, is this actually true? You own this entire towering skyscraper. You are the billionaire investor buying Preston's tech company." The aggressive, demanding father, who had violently thrown my canvas luggage into the dirt just 2 weeks prior, was now looking at me with the desperate, pleading eyes of a starving beggar. The sudden, sickening shift in his demeanor from a screaming tyrant to a groveling subordinate was utterly repulsive. He was actively trying to rewrite our entire history in real time, attempting to instantly transform himself back into a proud, loving father the absolute second he realized my staggering net worth. I did not break eye contact with Preston when I answered my father. "I own absolutely everything, Harrison," I stated coldly, purposefully refusing to use his paternal title. "I own the proprietary software routing global cargo ships. I own the massive server farms processing international trade. I own this company. I own this building. And you are all currently sitting in my execution chamber." The complete realization of their absolute financial doom settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They had walked into this building expecting a wealthy, faceless savior. They had brought their arrogant demands and their unearned superiority complex, expecting to leave as wealthy, triumphant conquerors. Instead, they found the exact daughter they had ruthlessly discarded sitting on a massive corporate throne, holding the absolute power to determine their entire future with a single signature. The useless failure they had evicted to the streets was now their judge, jury, and ultimate executioner. The reality of my $27 million empire had officially set in, and their perfect, arrogant lives were officially over. I opened the thick black dossier resting securely under my hands, the sharp, distinct rustle of premium paper slicing effortlessly through the absolute suffocating silence of the executive boardroom. I did not look at them as a loving daughter, but rather as an apex predator, carefully assessing deeply wounded prey. I began reading directly from the extensive forensic audit my acquisitions team had meticulously compiled over the past 48 hours. Let us discuss the actual harsh reality of Nova Flow, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the towering glass walls. You currently have a monthly burn rate of $600,000. Your customer acquisition cost is completely catastrophic, your retention metrics are entirely fabricated, and your proprietary cloud architecture is literally just a poorly coded patchwork of outsourced open-source software that crashes constantly during peak hours. Preston slumped lower in his seat, a heavy bead of cold sweat visibly rolling down his pale temple. I turned the heavy page, the sound sharp and entirely unforgiving. But gross incompetence is certainly not a federal crime, Preston. Embezzlement and wire fraud, however, carry incredibly strict mandatory minimum sentencing. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. You illegally commingled venture capital funds with your personal accounts to lease Chloe's white BMW, to pay for your country club memberships, and to fund your pathetic illusion of a billionaire lifestyle. And when the walls started closing in, when the auditors started asking serious financial questions, you could not answer. You took out a predatory $3 million bridge loan from a private equity firm that is currently preparing to completely destroy you. I shifted my gaze from the crumbling tech founder directly to my father. Harrison was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white, his breathing shallow and erratic. And this brings me to your massive fatal contribution to this disaster, Harrison. I flipped to the third section of the dossier and slid a crisp copy of the loan origination document across the polished glass table. It stopped precisely in front of him. You thought you were signing paperwork to become a senior board member of an elite tech firm. You thought you were brilliantly securing your financial legacy. Because you were so blindingly eager to impress your wealthy friends, you never bothered to hire independent legal counsel to read the fine print. You foolishly co-signed Preston's emergency bridge loan, leveraging the deed to your suburban home as the primary collateral. Valerie let out a sharp, ragged gasp, clutching her chest as she finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of the situation. Harrison grabbed the document with violently trembling hands, scanning the bold print confirming his absolute financial ruin. You pledged the house to a private equity firm. I continued, my voice entirely devoid of any mercy. A loan that Preston has officially defaulted on as of yesterday afternoon. The aggressive creditors are not going to wait. They are going to initiate immediate asset seizure protocols. You are going to lose the house. You are going to face massive public foreclosure. You are going to be completely stripped of everything you value in this world. The severe gravity of my words hit them like a physical blow. The arrogant facade completely shattered, instantly replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Harrison dropped the loan document, his face collapsing into a mask of pure terror. Maya, please, he begged, his voice cracking as he reached a shaking hand across the glass table toward me. You cannot let this happen to us. We are your parents. We raised you. You have to buy this company and pay off the loan right now. You have $27 million. $3 million is nothing to you. It is spare pocket change. You can save our home today. Valerie wept uncontrollably, completely ruining her carefully applied makeup. She leaned forward, clasping her hands together in a desperate, frantic prayer. Oh God, Maya, you are our only hope. Please, sweetie, I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said to you. We were just stressed out. We did not mean any of those horrible things. We love you so much. You are our brilliant, successful daughter. Family must always protect each other. You have to show some family loyalty and bail us out. We will do absolutely anything you ask of us. I looked at the weeping woman who had happily extorted $5,000 from me just 2 weeks prior. I looked at the broken man who had violently hurled my canvas duffel bag into the dirt without a second thought. I reached into my tailored suit jacket, pulled out my smartphone and tapped the high-definition screen. I did not raise my voice. I simply pressed play and set the device down heavily on the glass table. My father's aggressive, booming voice suddenly filled the silent boardroom, echoing off the high glass walls from the recording I had taken exactly 14 days ago. Go live in the streets. You are nothing but a useless failure. Do not come crying to us when you realize how hard the real world actually is. The recording ended, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. I picked up my phone and slipped it smoothly back into my pocket. You demanded that I go live in the streets, I stated coldly, looking directly into my father's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I am simply returning the favor. You explicitly told me I was a useless failure, so it would be incredibly irresponsible of me to intervene in your complex financial matters now. Preston finally found his voice, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Maya, if you do not buy NovaFlow today, the federal authorities will be notified by tomorrow morning. I will go to prison. You cannot send your own brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I closed the thick dossier and slid it back toward Keisha. I am not sending you anywhere, Preston, I replied with the clinical emotional detachment of a mortician. Your own fraudulent accounting and massive embezzlement are sending you to prison. Acquiring NovaFlow would require Auratech to absorb massive criminal liabilities and toxic debt. From a purely corporate standpoint, your company is a diseased asset, and I do not purchase garbage. The acquisition is officially denied. There will be no bailout, no golden parachute, and absolutely no mercy. I stood up from my leather executive chair, smoothing my designer jacket. Harrison let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying his face in his hands, as the brutal reality of his impending homelessness fully set in. Valerie wailed loudly, grabbing Chloe's arm, but Chloe violently shoved her mother away, screaming at Preston about her ruined life and the impending loss of her leased luxury vehicles. They were actively turning on each other like starving animals in a cage, tearing their toxic family dynamic to shreds as their fabricated empire collapsed entirely around them. I did not stay to watch the carnage unfold. I signaled to my legal team, turned on my heel, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the heavy frosted glass doors wide open behind me. I walked down the plushly carpeted hallway, the frantic sounds of their screaming and crying fading into absolute nothingness. The fallout was incredibly swift and exceptionally brutal. By the following Monday morning, the private equity firm had officially seized NovaFlow's remaining assets and contacted the federal authorities. Preston was arrested in the main lobby of his rented luxury condo, marched out in handcuffs under the glaring flash of local news cameras. Chloe filed for divorce the very next morning to shield herself from the massive financial blast radius, but was left entirely destitute when banks froze all their joint accounts. Harrison and Valerie faced a devastating, completely public foreclosure. The local sheriff's department forcibly removed them from the suburban house they had prized far above their own daughter. They were permanently expelled from their precious country club, their pristine social reputation entirely destroyed. They now reside in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, surrounded daily by the crushing weight of their immense arrogance. As for me, I stand on the sprawling terrace of my penthouse, looking out over the glittering, vibrant Atlanta skyline. The evening air is warm and deeply comforting. I sip a glass of crisp, sparkling water, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt for letting them fall. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed gravity to do its natural, inevitable work. The most valuable lesson I learned through this entire ordeal is that your worth is never dictated by the limited toxic perceptions of the people who demand your subservience. Family is not defined by shared genetics. It is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and authentic love. When people repeatedly show you that their affection is conditional upon your quiet submission, the most powerful thing you can do is to pack your bags, walk out the door, and quietly build an empire they could never possibly comprehend. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. I invite you to share your empowering stories in the comments below about walking away from toxic family members who underestimated your potential. If this journey of claiming karmic justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about rising from the ashes and claiming your ultimate worth.